The heart blood was naturally the first of the ingredients to take effect. It gave the salt water a faint reddish hue, causing it to bubble violently. Entering Percy's body, it made his heart beat faster, the rapid throbs echoing in his ears reminding him of his Troll's Fury potion. Only the ritual would last days, not minutes. Things weren't as bad until the secondary ingredients kicked in. The abyssal moss caused the temperature of Percy's body to fall off a cliff, making him feel as if somebody had emptied a bucket of snow into his veins. Thankfully, it wasn't all that different from handling Mickey's soul-freezing ice mana, so he could endure it, if barely. The toxins were 100 times more troublesome than Percy could have ever imagined. However, he had expected his body to go numb, much like Khasrith's had. But that wasn't at all what happened. Percy watched his arms and chest turn purple, his flesh swelling as dark lines branched through his circulatory system. Some body parts had indeed gone numb, but waves of excruciating agony gripped others. It felt like a million needles were stabbing at him from inside out, trying to rip him to shreds. His skin dried and flaked off, dark blood spilling into the bath and changing its color again. Percy instantly understood that this wasn't sustainable. Shit, I won't even last a minute like this, he thought, gritting his teeth. Knowing he couldn't afford to waste more time, he emptied the first of the green healing potions from his spatial seal directly into his stomach. A wave of vitality spread out of the organ, washing over his mutating flesh, bringing him some relief. This was Percy's first time ever drinking a potion of a higher grade than his own. He hadn't tried the guild's potions until after reaching Orange, so it was quite a novel experience. On paper, the green liquid contained as much life mana as 9 doses of Orange potion, but it was a lot more effective in practice, because Percy's body was far more sensitive to the potent mana. Even so, the brief healing failed to completely reverse the damage to his body. It merely slowed down the decay, though the itchy sensation it brought him was almost as unpleasant as the pain. That said, Percy didn't care how he felt. He was busy monitoring the effect of the potion, trying to calculate how long his stash would last. It's already about to fade. I'll need to drink 2 or even 3 doses per minute just to stabilize my condition. At this rate, I'll run out of green potions in under 2 hours. His heart sank as he realized that the hundreds of twice-compressed doses he had painstakingly brewed wouldn't even last for 5% of the ritual's duration. The idea of enduring the dangerous bath for days with nothing but yellow potions filled him with dread. Even though he'd prepared a lot of supplies in advance, it appeared that he had still underestimated how potent the demigod's blood was, especially to a yellow specimen of a species the lineage had never been meant for. "Do you want me to pull you out?" Mickey asked, his voice tinged with worry. "Don't," Percy hurriedly said. "It's too early to give up. I'm still in control." He forced himself to calm down, reminding himself that the ritual's effects were heavily front-loaded. If he wasn't mistaken, Khasrith had absorbed about 80% of the benefits during the first day. Percy had no idea how much the first 2 hours would do for him, but he hoped that the rest of the bath wouldn't be nearly as unpleasant. Sure enough, Percy had to consume the green potions much less frequently by the end of the first hour. Each now lingered inside his mutilated frame for close to a full minute before running out, which meant that his stash would easily last an additional hour over his earlier estimate, probably even more, if the trend continued. Naturally, he was quite ecstatic about this development, and not only because he finally saw hope of surviving the ordeal. More importantly, the fact that his resistance to the ingredients had climbed so fast was definitive proof that his human body could actually inherit the Thescalon mutation, something he hadn't been sure of. "The narrative has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the infringement." I wonder how much of a boost I'll receive. Well, there wasn't any point in guessing. He'd have his answers soon enough. The green potions ran out about half an hour after daybreak, making Percy's situation a whole lot more dangerous again. The yellow potions weren't nearly as effective, even when he consumed 3 or 4 of them at a time, and the odds of him and Mickey getting discovered by an enemy had also risen together with the sun. Percy would have prayed to Phoebe to watch over him, but he was worried the Titaness might actually hear the prayer, and he still wasn't sure she could be trusted. Thankfully, The damage the alien ritual inflicted on his body had lessened enough by now that the weaker potions could keep him alive, though the process hadn't grown any less painful. Every second brought with it more agony than any other physical injury Percy had incurred over the years. At least, it still paled in comparison to the soul pain his bloodline and traits had regularly caused him, allowing him to endure it relatively easily. Mickey and the clone stood next to the container the whole time, carefully scanning their surroundings for any sign of an enemy. In theory, flying high would have given them a better vantage point, but it would have also raised the odds of somebody noticing them. Percy's companions hadn't said anything, though he knew they were both paying him close attention, their barely concealed anxiety gushing through the cords. Everyone relaxed when the sun set for the second time, knowing that the worst of it was behind them. The dark blanket of night had enveloped them once more, shielding them from detection. Even the ritual was less dangerous by now. Percy's body was still a mess, but he felt like he could endure the rest of the bath even without the potions. I must have surpassed Kasrith's starting point already, Percy guessed. Opening his status, he checked his mutations to see if anything new had appeared, though there was nothing but his sovereign's eye there. Shrugging, he drank a few more healing potions, mostly to relieve some of his lingering pain from earlier, as he continued to wait for the ritual to end. The second day was as uneventful as the first one. Percy and Mickey were less concerned, because they knew he had already absorbed most of the benefits. The water in the makeshift vat was nearly black, due to the toxin's effect on his previously unmutated blood, the stench of rot and decay filling the small island. Mickey was forced to construct a thin dome around Percy to contain the scent, venting the air into the sea and funneling some clean oxygen into the dome every few minutes. During the afternoon, Percy started getting quite worried again. There was a lot to be happy about, including the fact that his life was no longer in danger, that it didn't matter as much if he got interrupted this late into the ritual, and that the bath had clearly enhanced his body a lot. However, it was looking increasingly unlikely that he would reach Kasrith's level. It had taken him most of the first day just to attain a body on par with the average Thescalan, and the second day hadn't imparted him with nearly as many benefits. Good thing I managed to bring an extra set of ingredients back. As the sun approached the horizon for the third time, Percy's status finally spoke. Congratulations! You have acquired a new mutation, Lesser Thescalan Physique. Reading the notification, Percy couldn't help but frown, feeling relieved and confused in equal parts. It wasn't that strange that he'd only inherited an inferior version of Kasrith's mutation, considering how much less effective the ritual had been on him so far. However, he was somewhat surprised to see his status notify him about the new mutation. Phoebe's decree had admittedly been more active since its latest evolution, having announced the upgrade of his Sorcerer's Eye and the acquisition of the scribing trait, but that didn't explain why it had remained silent when Kasrith had earned his version of the mutation on Thescala. Does it only care about things I can bring back to my main body? Percy wondered, harboring a random guess that he felt was close to the truth. Granted, the clone status had registered spells that he couldn't use with his own body in the past, such as his recently acquired instantaneous formation, but that was different. The spells themselves had always followed him back to Remir, waiting for some breakthrough that would allow him to use them. Foreign mutations and bloodlines, on the other hand, were typically useless for him, and it appeared that Phoebe's decree was smart enough to recognize that. Regardless, the status's whims weren't important right now. Not even waiting for the sun to fully set, Percy pulled up his page, reading the new entry. Mutations. As Sovereign's Eye draws from the cumulative knowledge listed in the status to enhance one's vision, allowing them to discern details previously unseen. A Lesser Thescalan Physique enhances one's physical strength and the toughness of their body. Enhances one's resistance to high or low temperatures and sharpens their thermal sense. Enhances one's resistance to toxins. Percy wanted to study the new entry some more, but he could do that after commencing the second ritual to save time. Getting out of the vat, he crafted a new container with Mickey's help, filling it with fresh seawater. He wasn't above dumping the contents of the last one in the ocean, since the toxins inside the liquid had been consumed by him already, leaving only blood and dried flakes of skin to feed the fishes. Still, releasing the stinky fluid in the sea was an unnecessary risk that could wait until Percy was fully done with the island. Jumping into the new container, he repeated his previous actions, emptying the ingredients into the bath. Percy hadn't bothered to brew new green potions, thinking that even the yellow ones were unnecessary at this point. Sure enough, the second round of purification began, this one already looking a great deal more manageable. There was no pain, swollen flesh, or sickly colors, just the familiar cold and numbness that Kassereth had experienced, indicating that Percy's body was better equipped to handle the transformation. Hopefully that means that I'll absorb more of the benefits this time, he thought. Only once he had settled into what was going to be his seat for the next couple of days did Percy read the new entry again, focusing on the differences from his treacherous hosts. Undersir. A lesser Thescalan physique. Enhances one's physical strength and the toughness of their body. Enhances one's resistance to high or low temperatures and sharpens their thermal sense. Enhances one's resistance to toxins. Undersir. The description was similar, except for a few missing greatly s before the verbs, suggesting that the effects of this lesser physique were modest, nothing too surprising. Fingers crossed that I'll get the full version by the time this is over. The second major change was the sentence pertaining to his resistance to toxins. If Percy wasn't mistaken, Kassereth's version had included a second part, something along the lines of, and the potency of their venom. Obviously, that wasn't applicable to Percy at all, so his status hadn't included it. However, what he found strange was the mention of a sharpened thermal sense, something that should have also not found its way into his body or his status. Thinking about that, Percy's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't help but move his tongue around, trying to determine whether it still had the same shape as before. The last thing he needed was to end up with a forked tongue like a snake's. He relaxed upon failing to notice any obvious changes, sticking his tongue out of his mouth in an attempt to feel the temperature of his surroundings. Yet, he experienced nothing of the sort, other than a faint numbness caused by either the ritual or the cold air a few centimeters above the surface of the frigid water. Weird. I wonder what that's all about. Coming up with a different theory, he shifted his attention to his familiar. Mickey, can you move closer? I want to check something. Percy would rather not move around too much during the early parts of the ritual, to avoid diminishing his gains by mistake. The bird heeded his instructions, walking next to the side of the vat facing him. Thankfully, the container was shorter than a person since Percy had designed it with the expectation of remaining seated through the bath. Meanwhile, the crow stood at twice a man's height, tall enough for Percy to scan much of the bird's body. Sure enough, he spotted a couple of things that he hadn't noticed in the past. Outside of the silver and gray flames corresponding to Mickey and the clone's souls, the dense green and yellow mana permeating their cores and channels, the colorful plumage visible in Percy's regular sight, and the ink-colored threads of willpower coursing through the mana, there was something else that stood out. Mickey's entire frame appeared darker than his surroundings, though a few spots were even darker than that. Namely, this applied to the patches of his body made of ice rather than flesh, the channels containing the 3 flavors of his ice mana, and the core in the bird's abdomen, but not the one in his sternum. In other words, everything even tangentially related to Mickey's ice affinity was pitch black in some new part of Percy's vision. Unable to resist the temptation, Percy glanced down at his own body, noticing that his flesh sported a dark blue hue in this same new sense. It was a couple shades brighter than his familiars, but still rather dim. And he had the ritual to thank for that, no doubt. Holy shit! The clone exclaimed, clearly having paid attention to the original throughout his investigation. Is that what I think it is? Unauthorized use. This story is on Amazon without permission from the author. Report any sightings. It has to be, Percy replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. His eyes had clearly inherited a form of thermal vision from the new mutation. Percy wasn't sure whether the bath had directly affected his eyes, or whether they had simply acquired this ability by interacting with the other mutation registered in his status, as they usually did, but nothing else could explain this phenomenon. Come to think of it, Mutations seem to synergize a lot more with one another than spectral traits or blessings do. Granted, this was Percy's first time having multiple mutations, having just acquired his second one. But his familiar had possessed several of them for years now, and this was something they had noticed a while ago. The 4 mutations in the crow's body were deeply interwoven, with the crystalline feathers created by ice sculpture being even more compatible with the Wind Dancer mutation than the regular ones, and the Soul Predator mutation having already spread to nearly every corner of Mickey's body. In fact, Percy was confident that ice sculpture wouldn't have even been possible without Thin Blood and Soul Predator. Compared to that, spectral traits didn't seem to tolerate each other nearly as well, with each absorbed fiend bringing Percy to the verge of death. If it hadn't been for the blessing, he wouldn't have even been able to acquire a second trait. As for the blessings themselves, there wasn't any way for 2 of them to coexist in a mortal's core, at least according to Zoras. I wonder what will happen if I keep gaining new mutations. There didn't seem to be an upper limit to the number he could have at once, and it appeared that the more he obtained, the stronger they would all become. Perhaps they might all merge eventually, giving rise to something special. Of course, Percy would have tried to get his hands on more mutations anyway, since each of them was useful by itself, but now he had another reason to seek them out. His future goals aside, he was extremely happy with his new thermal sense. His status clearly didn't think much of it, having not even bothered to change the name of Percy's eyes this time. It wasn't that strange, since thermal vision was arguably less useful than mana sense, soul vision, or the ability to perceive willpower. It wouldn't necessarily help him much in a high-level battle, as it wasn't easy to lay his eyes on an opponent's body directly, and there were often many elements obscuring one's temperature. Alchemy was a different story, however. While Percy's ability to see willpower had been useless while brewing, the ability to scan the temperature of a concoction would aid him greatly when dissolving the solid lumps, accelerating the reactions and improving his yield. I can't wait to put all of my recent gains into practice and see how much I can improve, he thought, though he immediately quashed the rising enthusiasm with a deep sigh. Alchemy would have to wait until after the mission to the fungal spire. Other than his mutated eyes, Percy guessed his body had grown far stronger and hopefully more flexible, and that he could now handle Mickey's ice mana a little better. Sadly, he couldn't test any of those things until the ritual ended, since he could hardly feel his limbs right now. With nothing else to do, he waited for another 2 days to pass, occasionally tossing some food and healing potions into his stomach to undo the damage from the first bath. By the end of the final day, Percy received the notification he'd been waiting for. Congratulations! Your mutation has evolved. Lesser Thescalan Physique - Greater Thescalan Physique. As soon as the stinky bathwater stopped bubbling entirely, Percy stretched his limbs inside the vat, realizing he could move again. Getting out of the container, he carefully peeled the outer layer of dead skin off the slimy, purple remnants of the first ritual that he hadn't bothered to remove 2 days prior, revealing the healthy skin beneath. Percy had tanned a lot after spending months under the sun, but the new skin was a couple shades paler, unmarred and unblemished, like a newborn's. Throwing a couple of punches in the air, he noticed to his great joy that he was faster than before, his fists causing booming shockwaves that no yellow human should have been capable of. Percy's joints felt like they could bend and twist a little farther, filling him with confidence that he could handle his third parade now. With the carnival and a yellow Troll's Fury tattoo, there shouldn't be a problem. Asking his clone to pump some soul-freezing ice into his channels, Percy soon discovered that the exotic resource didn't bother him nearly as much as it used to. He'd likely be able to unleash multiple needles in a row without any additional downtime. Finally, even his new thermal sense felt a bit sharper than it had before the second bath. Summoning and wearing his cloak, he hopped on Mickey's neck, asking his familiar to dump the vats and the pieces of the crystalline dome into the ocean before taking off. At the same time, Percy pulled up his status, reading the modified entry. A greater Thescalan physique greatly enhances one's physical strength and the toughness of their body. Greatly enhances one's resistance to high or low temperatures and sharpens their thermal sense. Greatly enhances one's resistance to toxins. The three Greatly S were back with a vengeance, the entry now reading almost the same as his former host's, save for the missing part about his venom. Perhaps one of his future mutations might unlock that facet of his physique as well, though Percy didn't care about it too strongly. Shrugging, he had the crow turn westward again, flying straight toward the fungal spire. Taking his cauldron out, Percy set it on the bird's head, tossing a few doses of Troll's Fury ink and some gravity ingredients in. He hoped to get himself some new tattoos by the time they neared their destination, certain that he possessed the means to both brew them and handle them far better than ever before. The past couple of years had been tough, but he and his familiar had achieved everything they'd set out to do. They were finally ready to commence one of their most important missions, the sleeping remnants of an entire civilization resting on their shoulders. There was no doubt in Percy's mind that many powerful mages would try to stop them, but he welcomed the challenge with open arms. Percy didn't even flinch as the gray needle pierced his skin for the 1,000th time that day, injecting the green fluid into his body. Only when he was done drawing the 15th leaf on his lower forearm did he take a short break to catch his breath, carefully examining the tattoo. It was shaped like a vine, coiling around his left arm, all the way from his shoulder down to near his wrist. Each leaf represented a single dose of ink that would last for a while before degrading, unless he was forced to use it sooner, of course. Compressing the healing ink wasn't very different from the potions. It required about the same amount of pressure, and only the slightest variations in the frequency of the pulses. The tattoos were more effective than the potions too, due to the nature of the mushrooms Percy had brewed them out of, so having a few green-grade variants to fall back to in a pinch gave him some peace of mind. On one hand, this was the most potent source of healing he could currently prepare for himself. On the other, he knew the marginal improvement from potions to tattoos wasn't worth the time or the resources when he needed to consume hundreds of doses in short order. This was why he hadn't bothered to prepare any for the ritual, sticking with regular potions. However, he wasn't going to skimp on his safety when it came to a dangerous fight. In that case, quality generally beat quantity, as it would allow him to mend much nastier wounds, and to do so faster. I should still be careful. The tattoos may be potent, but I doubt I'll be able to regrow a missing limb or recover from a serious injury, he reminded himself, suddenly feeling a little envious of his friend's mutation. Storing the empty vials into his seal, he summoned a few filled with a brown liquid into his hands. This was naturally yellow-grade Troll's Fury ink that he had also compressed. The recipe for it differed a little more, since it required an entirely different base ingredient from the healing ink. Even so, Percy hadn't had much trouble figuring out the correct setup, thanks to his eyes and the newly registered principle. His yield was still abysmal, and would likely remain so until he got more practice. But he didn't care about it too much, because he only used the Troll's Fury tattoos in an emergency and didn't require too many doses. Taking the time to improve his efficiency only made sense for products that he needed lots of. Percy hadn't even attempted to compress this flavor of ink a second time. Not that he couldn't, but he was more cautious when it came to these tattoos than the others. While he felt confident that his strengthened body could now handle the strain of tattoos matching his grade in tandem with his boosting art, he'd rather test that in battle before going a step farther. About an hour later, Percy finished drawing the Troll King's face on his chest. The tattoo generally looked better on his back, but it was harder to reach there by himself, and optics weren't a priority right now. The sun is about to set, he noticed. The past few days had felt a little longer for him and Mickey, as they'd been flying westward at full speed, thus stretching both daytime and nighttime slightly. Regardless, their extended trip over the ocean was about to come to an end, as the coast was already within view. Tapping into his familiar senses, Percy immersed himself in his surroundings, appreciating his final sunset out at sea. Mickey was flying pretty low to delay detection by their enemies for as long as possible. He was gliding as quietly as he could above the surface, the force of the frigid tornado swirling around his body propelling him forward more than the infrequent flapping of his wings did. He allowed his talons to sink into the water, the liquid feeling as hard as stone at this speed. The crow's sharp claws still carved into the blue sheet with ease, spilling a trail of foam in his wake. Objectively speaking, the seawater was rather cold this far north, though to Percy and his familiar it might as well have been tea. A salty breeze assaulted their nostrils as they enjoyed the sun's gradual descent, the sky slowly shifting from one vibrant hue to the next as the star disappeared behind the mountains in the distance. Every now and then, Mickey flapped his powerful wings, planting a short-lived lotus in the water, its white petals sprinkled with icy powder that glittered beneath the fading sunlight. Before long, the sea was replaced by sand, though that barely lasted a moment before they flew past the beach and into the vast stretches of grasslands that Percy knew would paint most of the ensuing journey. Hills and plains alike were covered in washed-up yellows and golds, the chirping insects having long gone silent as a few trees stood half-naked here and there, slowly shedding what remained of their withering coats. Every now and then, a brown leaf drifted toward Percy, though it never got a chance to plaster itself onto his body, shredded into brittle powder by the violent gusts spiraling around his familiar. Still, the mana-rich wind didn't stop Percy from smelling the nostalgic scent of decaying plant matter and wet dirt, or hearing the faint flaps of migrating birds flying in intricate formations in the horizon. I guess it should be late autumn, Percy thought, having long lost track of the seasons. In his defense, there weren't many ways to tell in the ocean, other than counting days, of course. Percy sure hoped that they wouldn't be discovered immediately, although he understood that it was only a matter of time. He was confident that he and Mickey could outspeed most blues with ease, so he wasn't as worried about being chased. But there were several bloodlines out there that could facilitate fast communication. If the wrong family caught wind of their movements, the information could easily reach House Asclepius or the Divine Root. From there, the rest of Remir would find out soon enough, and all the hunting parties would start converging towards them. Are you afraid they'll start sending more than 4 or 5 people after us at a time? Mickey asked. Hard to know, but that isn't a huge problem by itself, Percy replied with a shrug. How so? Well, on paper, a group of 5 blues can hold their own against a violet, but that assumes that the violet sticks around to face them head-on. In practice, battle power doesn't scale as neatly with numbers. A violet can just escape from any group of blues with relative ease, and the same applies to us, so gathering too many in the same location only makes them less effective. Their stacked domains would still slow us down, Mickey protested. They would, but only if they remain close to one another, which, again, would lead to the same problem, Percy patiently explained. Basically, unless they have more veteran assassins with space affinities to send, they'll struggle to contain us. Mickey tilted his head in confusion. If that's the case, then why are you stressing over being spotted? Percy sighed. I'm not as worried about an ambush in a random location that we can easily avoid. However, it'll be a huge problem if they figure out that we're heading toward the fungal spire and fortify the place before we get there. Mickey nodded in understanding, not saying anything else. Bringing a couple of starry commanders to the verge of death and planting soul clones in their bodies should be easy enough, but it would inevitably take some time. Not much time, but more than Percy would have while being chased by over a dozen blues. Thankfully, he didn't think his previous movements had given his enemies any clues as to his goal, and he was confident that he and Mickey could make the trip before their pursuers got the chance to organize. Let's prepare for the worst-case scenario, though. Percy didn't have any personal projects that would yield meaningful results in the little time he had left, but Mickey's boosting art could still use some work. The crow had already figured out all 4 of the spell's patterns, so it was just a question of scaling the technique up to its limits, maximizing the flow and conversion of ambient mana and using it to fuel his fighting style as seamlessly as Percy had done with his own version. Mickey's battle against the trio of blues had been quite unpleasant, but it had provided him and the clone with valuable insight on how to iron out the last few kinks from the spell. Sharing his senses with the crow, Percy assisted his companions, thinking that a third mind might help them complete the looming upgrade that much sooner. All of the bird's spells already used the snowstorm spiraling around him as fuel, be it to empower his body, protect him from harm, accelerate his flight, feed his beast core, or deliver devastating attacks to his enemies from near and afar. The only thing left was to maximize the efficiency of all of those tasks and elevate the spell to the next level. Over the following few days, Percy and Mickey passed over multiple lakes, forests, and even a couple of small mountains, though it was still plains and hills for the most part. They saw a few towns and villages too, but they opted to circle around those to minimize the odds of getting spotted. Sadly, their luck ran out at some point. Despite their efforts to delay the inevitable, they eventually caught the attention of several passers-by, be they merchants, messengers, or even bandits. Had this been a few years ago, Percy might have hoped that they wouldn't recognize him, but he understood that was no longer a realistic possibility, given how infamous he and his familiar had gotten. Somebody else in his shoes might have considered the unthinkable, to eliminate all the witnesses on site before they got the chance to rat him out to the great houses. For better or for worse, Percy wasn't the type of person who'd stoop that low, however. Not only did the idea of murdering a bunch of innocents to maybe prevent a fraction of them from inconveniencing him sicken him to his stomach, he knew it wouldn't even solve the problem. He didn't think he'd be able to kill everyone anyway, so the news of his return would leak sooner or later. "Our best chance is to keep going," he said, 3 waves of determination gushing through the cords. Mickey rose higher, since there was no longer a point to sticking close to the ground now that the cat was out of the bag. If anything, the cover would only make it easier for their enemies to sneak up on them. Without any further need for stealth, Percy also had his familiar fly even faster. That way, they could cover more ground, and pushing the boosting art to its boundaries was conveniently the quickest way to complete its upgrade. Things remained peaceful for a couple more days, though everyone was aware that it wasn't going to last. Sure enough, the first group of hostile blues appeared about a week into their journey on the mainland, blocking their path. "Do we fight or ignore them?" Mickey asked as the quartet of blues loomed ahead. Even from hundreds of meters away, the enemy mages' faces appeared solemn. The poor bastards clearly understood the level of danger they were in, but their superiors had probably left them no choice but to try and get in Percy's way. Of course, Mickey was more than fast enough to circle around them and skip the fight entirely if necessary, but Percy was still trying to decide whether that was the best course of action. "I don't want to kill more people than we have to, and I would rather not waste time on them." Still, the problem was that the groups Percy left standing might not give up. There was a good chance they'd chase after him and Mickey, following them all the way to the fungal spire and drawing even more attention in the process. That would lead to everyone figuring out Percy's goal even sooner. If that wasn't bad enough, they would also constitute a hidden danger should Percy and Mickey face trouble at their destination. They'd have to worry about the additional blues catching up from behind and placing them in an even tougher spot. Sighing, he stood on his familiar's back, knowing that dealing with the blues here was the safest option. For we're a lot. It was on par with the previous group, the most he and Mickey had ever faced at once. Thankfully, they would probably be much weaker without the dangerous assassin in their ranks. The sheer number of hostile domains would certainly be an issue, but both Percy and Mickey had grown stronger over the past few days. Summoning a pair of scythes from his spatial seal, he rolled his shoulders, taking a deep breath after another to push the carnival to its limits. Gray flares of phantom mana danced erratically around him, painting a stark contrast against the pale backdrop of snow spinning around the crow. 3 minutes. That's all the time we can afford to spend here. Any more and we'd be better off just escaping, Percy said, getting a round of mental nods back from his companions. Peering ahead, he scanned his opponents carefully, trying to spot any clues that might help, though he came up empty-handed. The group appeared to contain mages from 2 different houses, allied ones, most likely, but Percy failed to identify them. Hopefully, they wouldn't have any troublesome bloodlines. 2 women were dressed in cyan robes, the badge pinned to the left side of their chests depicting either a stag or a tree, though it was hard to tell what exactly it was from that distance, the screen of icy mist partially obscuring Percy's vision, not making things any easier. The other 2, a lanky man and a woman dressed in yellow clothes, had insignias depicting the sun. Sadly, contacting Nesha wasn't an option at the moment, so Percy would have to go in blind. There was no way to tell whether these people had been part of the previous manhunt from a few months ago, or if they'd recently been asked to join due to him and Mickey roaming close to their family's lands. Either way, this was Percy's first time seeing any of them. It was also clearly their first time seeing him, the famous criminal they had likely heard so much about. Despite their apparent advantage in numbers and information, The lanky man floating in the center left of the group swallowed visibly after meeting Percy's scrutinizing gaze. Evidently, he had hoped that the encounter wouldn't have devolved into a fight to the death. Sadly for him, that hope was quickly dashed as Percy chose to call their bluff. Regardless, the enemy Blues didn't wait passively for Percy and Mickey to attack. Instead, they seized the initiative when they were still about 100 meters away. Two attacked from either side, violent torrents of water shooting at the Crow and his rider. The others didn't sit idly either, launching a colossal boulder and a massive fireball that rolled together into a red-hot meteor, flying straight toward Percy's face, leaving a long, smoking trail in its passing. Mickey dove to avoid the powerful spells, something that the stacked domains made extremely difficult. The thick willpower felt like an ocean of honey, making even the slightest movement a monumental struggle. The sooner we bring one of them down, the sooner we'll have some breathing room, Percy noted. The Crow spun, using the rotating sheet of ice mana imbued with his own willpower as a knife to shave off part of the hostile domains, Percy grabbing against his familiar's plumage firmly to remain glued to his back. Mickey barely managed to fly beneath the oversized blasts in time, but Percy didn't care about that. He grinned, seeing an opportunity in the chaos. Stolen story. Please report. The enemy group fired a second round of attacks, but Percy and Mickey had an easier time dodging this one, knowing what affinities to expect at least. Scattering broken shafts in his surroundings, Percy gathered as much soul-freezing ice mana as the clone had already provided him into his hand. Pointing his palm at a weakness he spotted in the walls of mana and willpower visible in his mutated eyes, he aimed at one of the silver silhouettes hiding behind the obstructions. Then he fired. The soul-crushing needle phased through the aquamarine river shooting from his right side, drilling soundlessly through the inky black lines permeating the magical liquid. The woman he was targeting appeared to realize the danger she was in at the very last second, her silhouette flaring with horror as she tried to dodge. Percy never saw the attack land, having been forced by the apocalyptic explosion just over his head to duck on Mickey's back. Still, it must have found its mark, judging by the woman's lifeless body plummeting toward the ground a moment later, her eyes glazed over. Just like that, the first of their four opponents had been dealt with, a quarter of the suffocating pressure vanishing right with her. Percy didn't allow himself to relax, however, knowing that this was the best time to follow up with a second blow to his opponent's morale. Leaping off Mickey's back, he jumped from one pair of crossed shafts to the next, heading toward the lanky Blue, the fire affinity user. The enemy mages looked shocked by their companion's sudden death, but that barely lasted an instant. Regaining his composure, the Earth user tried to assist her male teammate in stopping Percy, while the surviving water mage was forced to attack Mickey instead. Percy found it difficult to build up momentum inside so many domains, though he managed to dodge most of the attacks flying toward him by slipping through narrow gaps in the willpower. Splitting their domains between two moving targets clearly wasn't easy for the Blues. Hovering a few dozen meters away from his target, Percy put as much pressure on him as possible to give Mickey a chance to take another one down. The Crow spun faster and faster, the howling blizzard hugging his frame intensifying with each revolution. The pale winds connected with his oversized beak, increasing its penetrating power and range greatly as they propelled him forward. Another river of compressed water shot toward the bird, but Mickey didn't bother to dodge this one, meeting it head-on. A grinding screech permeated the aerial battlefield, the magical liquid freezing and shattering into a cloud of fine powder that sparkled under the dim sunlight. The spell barely slowed the oversized bird, Mickey's beak snapping shut around the woman's core a second later, ripping her body apart in the process. Congratulations! Your familiar spells have merged. Dance of the Savage Gods, Masterful plus Wild Art. Consumption Masterful plus Wild Art. Winter's Fong, Masterful-Wild Art. Symbol of the Savage Gods, Masterful. Under different circumstances, Percy might have cracked a smile. His friend had finally completed his boosting art after decades of relentless efforts, merging all of his spells into a top-tier masterful spell on par with the Carnival. Unfortunately, he was somewhat busy with his own side of the fight at the moment, though he was about to get markedly less so. Tiptoeing around and through a barrage of stone javelins as thick as tree trunks, he rapidly approached his prey. The disappearance of another domain finally allowed him to pick up speed, rendering his opponents powerless to keep him at bay. The lanky man tried to dodge, of course, but he was no match for Percy's speed. Clearly realizing that he was done for, he unleashed what was left of his reserves as Percy's scythes sank into his torso, probably trying to take his killer down with him. A tsunami of flames burst out of every pore in the Blue's body, incinerating his clothes in an instant before slamming onto Percy. Percy didn't panic, however, believing in his own means to protect him. He pulled his hood down to shield his face, pouring mana into his cloak's runes. The reinforced silk and the structural integrity enchantments negated most of the force. At the same time, he fed what little ice mana he'd been able to recover into the heating runes, relying on them and his freshly tempered body to resist the scorching flames. The blast still sent him flying back, of course. He took a moment or two to regain his balance, feeling like he'd been struck by a charging ram. Thankfully, his injuries were rather light, and his familiar had already attacked the fourth Blue to defend him. The rest of the battle didn't hold much suspense. The water mage appeared to realize that she didn't stand a chance, though she still fought to her last breath to delay Percy and Mickey, if only by a few more seconds. Whether she was acting out of stubbornness, hatred over her relative's demise, a misguided sense of duty, or something else entirely, Percy didn't know nor care. He and Mickey cleaned up the battlefield as soon as she was dead, storing any elixirs they could find into his spatial seal while feeding the cores to the crow. Climbing onto his familiar's back, Percy instructed the bird to resume his flight, leaving Remir poorer by 4 more Blues. It hadn't even been a full 3 minutes. I don't really know your father outside of that one memory of him that we've watched together, but from what little I have seen, I'm sure that he would have been very proud of you, the clone said upon noticing his host's elation. The crow nodded contentedly, the warmth in his soul a poor match for the chill in his crystalline bones. Sadly, Mickey had been separated from both of his parents at a very young age, missing the chance to learn the second part of the dance from them, assuming they even knew it. Even after decades of fighting for his life in the Colosseum, he had failed to discover the external elements of the boosting art by himself, dying a gruesome death at Mixcoatl's hands. Thanks to his second chance at life, he and Percy had finally amended that grave injustice, figuring out the rest of the spell. However, Mickey's most recent upgrade constituted far more than a personal achievement. It was an important milestone for the people of Huehue as a whole, and proof of something beyond the original form of the boosting art. Going a step farther than anyone before them, Percy and Mickey had upgraded the technique to the carnival and symbol of the savage gods. Granted, those versions were tied to their unique circumstances, requiring their specific affinities and mutations to work, among other things. Suffice to say, they weren't usable by anybody else. Even so, their ability to improve upon their wild arts to this extent had proven that Mickey's heritage had been incomplete to start with, that Raziel and his greedy allies had devastated Huehue before Mickey's ancestors managed to fully explore the limits of their grand invention. If Percy was right, there was a lot more that could be done with it. Perhaps, he and his familiar would bring a more generalized upgrade of the boosting art back to the crow's homeland one day, teaching it to its enslaved inhabitants and driving their oppressors away. Let's focus on surviving the Blues and Violets here on Remir first, before daydreaming about challenging gods. The clone thought with a sigh. Turning his attention inwards, he resumed working on the same project that had kept him busy for the past few months. The clone had spent all his efforts trying to improve his secret art, at least whenever he hadn't been helping Mickey with his own spell. Now that both the crow and Percy's main body had reached the limit of their individual strength for the near future, it was time to finally perfect their teamwork. The two had already grown quite proficient at sharing their senses and fighting side by side without getting in each other's way. But that wasn't quite the same as fully leveraging the advantage of their intimate connection. That was why the clone had slowly developed a system that he hoped would allow his companions to cooperate better. "I'm ready to return," he told the original, peeling his wisp off the surface of Mickey's soul and unwinding the cords on the way back to his own body. His memories blended with the original's, Two similar but not identical recounts of the past few months flashing before his eyes. Weaving the intricate cloak, slowly perfecting Mickey's boosting art, eating half-roasted fish while gazing at the tall waves. His time in Thescala, registering the compression principle, chasing the slippery assassin, enduring the painful onslaught of his three subordinates, undergoing the dangerous ritual, returning to the mainland. The clones Percy equipped Mickey with were some of his longest lived. Under different circumstances, assimilating half a year's worth of memories would have been a daunting and disorienting experience. Luckily, the process was made smoother by the fact that they'd shared their senses throughout the majority of those moments and had been largely aware of each other's thoughts. Once his throbbing headache had calmed down a little, Percy pulled out another chunk of his soul, using his family's technique to fashion it into a thrumming blob of gray mana. He knew he had to act fast, not only because the next group of blues might show up at any moment, but also because this was the last morsel of practice he would get at crafting his clones before the operation in the fungal spire. Percy hadn't sent out any clones lately, opting to sacrifice a few weeks of adventuring to keep his cords available. He planned to possess as many blue wasps as the situation would allow, to maximize his odds of getting his hands on the egg. There's still a good chance I'll fail, but I suppose I can always place Nephthys' soul in a different body and try again for a wasp familiar some other time. Shaking the unpleasant possibilities of failure out of his mind, he severed the gray wisp from the rest of his soul. All his senses went dark as a result, making him realize that he was the new clone. That state only lasted a moment before he found himself embracing his familiar soul again. If you stumble upon this tale on Amazon, it's taken without the author's consent. Report it. Applying a layer of phantom mana to keep himself from merging with the crow, he allowed his wisp to spread along the silver surface, moving around one of the cords to wrap the second around it. As soon as the twin connections were tightly coiled together, he worked with the main body to widen them again, reactivating Soul Harmony, the spell that formed the very foundation of his ongoing project. He and his companions then took a few minutes to clear their minds and get used to their new reality before continuing on their journey to the fungal spire. It wasn't until a couple of hours later, when everyone had fully calmed down and made peace with their shuffled thoughts, that they began working on the spell. Strictly speaking, recycling the clone hadn't been necessary, because the main body's role in the new technique was minimal. The brunt of the work would be handled by the clone, who already understood what he was supposed to do, having spent months planning everything out. That said, bringing the original up to speed would only make everything easier. "I'm starting," the clone warned. A soft melody rang in their shared mind, one that they all found intimately familiar. Naturally, it was the song that the original Mickey had played on his kicklet for Percy back on Hue Hue, the music that Percy had tried his best to replicate on his shoddy ocarina. The very same tune that had allowed him to inadvertently, yet successfully, restore some of his friends' forgotten memories on a couple of occasions, upgrading his secret art both times in the process. Initially, the clone hadn't intended the song to form the basis of a third spell upgrade. He had merely wanted to help his friend. Seeing how his main body had been too busy with other matters to play the instrument for Mickey, he had taken it upon himself to reproduce the melody directly through the connection, in an attempt to jog more of the bird's memories. The intimate connection provided by Soul Harmony was already potent enough for the song to sound crisp and clear in everyone's minds, especially to Mickey, who even shared a body with the clone. In fact, the music currently sounded as if it was played on a real instrument by a master musician, since Percy could just ignore any physical limitations like his lacking pair of limbs or insufficient practice. Of course, the tune was slightly different from the original, though that was by design. At some point, the clone had decided to play around with some variations because he hadn't been able to dig any new memories out with the previous version in a while, and because the song had an additional purpose now. Reno ES. The main part of the tune was the one that Percy had never quite managed to reproduce on the ocarina, an uplifting melody, like something a mother would play for her child to cheer them up. Percy had given it some extra flavor, however, enriching the music further. It was performed by the gentle voice of the whistling pines that Percy and Mickey had spent their early days listening to, a healthy dose of added optimism forcefully injected into the song to remind the crow that he was no longer alone in the world. spoke of a fresh start and a new family, of camaraderie and a second chance at life, of dreams and ambitions. The second part had changed somewhat too, but not as much. The clone was playing it in the sound of the original kicklet again, though it was more prominent than before, as if demanding an equal place in the composition as its louder counterpart. It was solemn and melancholic, reminding Percy and Mickey of all the hardships that they had endured, of all the challenges that they had overcome. It spoke of adversity and of the fight for one's place in the world, like a people cursed without an affinity, trying to protect their home, or a boy with a red core, looked down by all. But it now also spoke of Remir's wrath, and of the frigid wastelands on Huehue's dark side, of cruel gods, scheming titans, and treacherous allies, of countless enemies seeking one's death, and of the tragic fate that had befallen one's family, of decades spent imprisoned in a dark cell, or enslaved by a sadistic boy, of longing toward an impossible goal, and a bitter race against time itself. Mickey had actually been the one to request many of the changes. The crow had told the clone that he no longer sought to return to the person he'd once been. He did wish to recall his past, but to also retain his present, the new life he'd been given, and to fight alongside Percy, forging a new future for them both. Fortunately, the melody's more balanced duality worked in Percy's favor too, given what he wanted to achieve with it. What had started as the clone's attempt to help Mickey had transformed into something else, something just as important. He had realized at some point that this was the perfect way for his main body and Mickey to coordinate in battle. Like a conductor, the clone could push either part of the melody to the forefront, to signal the others to attack or fall back. Even better, the dense information contained in the rich song would allow him to convey more detailed strategies to his companions. By adjusting certain features, such as the tempo or the pitch of either tune, he could let the others know whether to group up or spread out, when to defend each other or put pressure on their enemies, or even when to change targets. That way, the original and the crow could focus on their own battles for the most part, while the clone tapped into their senses, observing the entire battlefield from two distinct vantage points, and making the best decisions for the group. The best part is that they don't even need much practice to get this to work, the clone thought, a hearty grin tugging at the corners of his borrowed beak. The clone had spent a lot of time considering how to best communicate the information to the others, fine-tuning the strategy to its most fundamental and actionable building blocks. By sharing Mickey's body, he could nudge the crow in the right direction until the latter got used to the spell. Meanwhile, by feeding his memories to his main body, he had already taught him everything he himself knew, meaning that they were almost ready to put everything to the test. Now, he just needed some volunteers to try the spell on. Luckily, Remir Salites didn't keep him waiting for too long, the second group of blues barring his path the very next day. As Percy and his companions approached the spire, the groups of blues barring his path grew more and more frequent. Clearly, his pursuers had already started converging toward the region, having probably been informed by their superiors about Percy's movements. Percy was torn between rushing ahead at full speed or varying his familiar's flight slightly to throw his enemies off. In the end, he chose the former option, thinking it would be safer. At least, the bounty hunters gave him and Mickey plenty of opportunities to test out his rapidly improving secret art. Under the clone's careful guidance, they took down one group of blues after the other, never wasting more than a minute or two. Initially, their teamwork was more than a little clunky. They both understood the theory behind the new spell, thanks to the clone's memories and constant hand-holding. But putting everything into practice during a heated battle still wasn't the easiest thing in the world. The situation slowly improved, however, as they gained experience. Despite their growing strength, Percy and Mickey were forced to steer clear of any groups with more than 5 members, knowing that they wouldn't stand a chance against them. Leaving so many of their pursuers alive to chase after them wasn't ideal, but there was nothing they could do about it. When it came to groups with exactly 5 blues, the situation was a little different. As Percy and Mickey continued improving, the thought of facing such teams had started sounding more and more sensible. In fact, Percy was confident he could already win if he resorted to his Troll's Fury tattoo. After carefully discussing it with his companions, He decided to delay such a gamble for as long as possible, however. Even if he emerged victorious, it wouldn't be quick, and he didn't have time to waste. Besides, he'd rather not use the tattoos before he absolutely had to. In the end, he and Mickey opted to only challenge groups with 4 members, the poor fools who had yet to realize the danger they were in. Before long, Percy found himself flying over a region he recognized. It was his first time in the area, but he'd heard of the large, ring-shaped lake located a few days east of the fungal spire, indicating to his great joy that he was nearing his destination. He and Mickey had already killed over 20 blues on the way, and that was without counting the assassins group or the ones they'd slaughtered the previous year. Naturally, they'd also looted plenty of elixirs in the process, growing their stash. Percy hadn't bothered to count his gains, but the added resources were bound to last him for several more years, especially once he raised his brewing yield and mastered the cascading cracks technique. Assuming we survive that long, he thought, reminding himself that his situation was still rather precarious. Sadly, most of the remaining groups behind and in front of him were too strong for him and Mickey to face. It had been a while since they last saw one with 4 members, and Percy doubted they'd ever encounter another. News of the eliminated mages had probably reached everyone's ears by now. This was why Percy had finally decided to take a risk and engage the next group of 5 they met, a team that possessed strength on par with a Violet. It wouldn't be an easy fight, but Percy wanted to seize the opportunity to see where he and Mickey stood. Furthermore, he felt that the clone was close to a breakthrough with the new spell, so a tough battle was exactly the kind of thing he needed. Either way, he was confident that he and his familiar were ready for the task at last, even without revealing his trump card. Reality proved a little harsher than expected. 5 domains were clearly too many to endure at once, even when their owners weren't the most skilled at wielding them. Mickey struggled to shake the pressure off, and Percy had a lot of trouble finding an opening to slip through his opponent's defenses. It appeared that they were going to spend longer here than Percy would have liked. Even so, he didn't give up. While he vowed not to challenge another group this powerful anytime soon, he still welcomed the opportunity to test his and his companions' growing might. The clone was improving the fastest among them, having added more features to his mental composition over the past few days, steadily expanding the scope of the spell. As for Percy and Mickey, they merely had to learn how to follow their conductor's instructions. The melody shifted mid-battle, the cheerful tune dipping into a darker, resonant note that thrummed through Percy's chest. Without thinking, he used his 4th parade, the dancing duets of the cloaked phantoms defending his familiar from a barrage of stone shards. The projectiles stabbed into the reinforced fabric but never managed to pierce through it completely. The song took on a lighter tone the next instant, prompting Percy to go on the offensive. Aiming his soul-crushing needle at the nearest opponent, he fired the spell, hoping it would land. He wanted to press on, to try and circle around another enemy with his first parade, but the clone stopped him. Mickey's part of the melody grew louder, prompting the crow to fly in front of Percy, shielding him from a large fireball that he hadn't noticed. The blast exploded against the tornado of mist, singeing some of the bird's feathers, but didn't do much more than that. Mickey's body was almost entirely made of ice by now, with only his most important organs still intact. Curiously, the transformation had only seemed to make him stronger, though Percy still had no intention of investigating whether his friend could regenerate a damaged brain. Unauthorized duplication. This narrative has been taken without consent. Report sightings. Oblivious to his thoughts, Mickey continued towards an isolated water mage, as the tempo of both tunes sped up, signaling Percy to join the offensive. He used his winding corridor to pressure his previous target, who had apparently dodged the deadly needle by the skin of his teeth. Like that, the battle raged on for several more minutes, as both sides fought for every advantage they could get their hands on. At the same time, a song that only Percy and his familiar could hear echoed in their minds, guiding their every move. Percy fought like a grim reaper shrouded in gray flames, dancing around the battlefield to pressure whomever his clone deemed necessary. He was nimbler than the crow, and had a wide assortment of offensive techniques to choose from, from the insidious needle that he couldn't fire as often as he would have liked but which was guaranteed to kill whomever it so much as touched, to the first parade that had the least penetrating force of all his spells but was the hardest to shake off, from the second parade that required some time to execute but could break through almost any barrier, to the fifth parade that was extremely lethal but harder to use in the presence of so many opponents that would surely help their teammate peel off the suffocating strips of fabric. Meanwhile, Mickey's movements were more straightforward, though his contribution wasn't any less important. He spun through the air like a frigid comet, supporting his friend. Through his tough and easily reparable body, he could soak a lot of damage, break through a barricade with brute force, shred the Blue's domains using the violent winds spiraling around him, or simply pick off any opponent that strayed from the group. It took a while, but the first of the enemy mages fell soon enough, the others quickly following. An interesting fact about the clone's melody was that it wasn't static like the original. It was ever-changing, with each battle requiring its own variation to overcome. It made the song sound fresh and unique on every occasion, reminding Percy a little of Ray's treatment on Melodia. At the end of the day, weren't people the same? Each had their own personal song serving as the key to their mind. In fact, the numerous versions of the melody that he and Mickey had listened to over the past few days had actually awakened a few more of the crow's forgotten memories. Most of them had been short-lived, momentary flashes. And today's was no exception. Mickey's mother was dragging him and his sister through the blizzard, frozen tears chilling his cheeks. The children both resisted the woman's efforts, trying to rush back to their father, though her grip only tightened around their wrists as she struggled to keep them by her side, failing to suppress her own sobs. The man's figure grew more distant by the second as the howling winds blocked Mickey's vision, though he could still faintly see the cyan ribbons fluttering around his father's body, and around the three men besieging him. Mickey's still as young as he was when he got his tattoos. Give or take a few weeks, Percy noted. The memory he and his familiar had watched yesterday must have been rather recent too. In that one, the boy's father had promised to teach him the dance once he was a little older, and to tell him the story of the second hero as soon as he mastered the spell, the story of the god who had died defending Huehue from Raziel's underlings before he got the chance to perfect the boosting art he had invented. Sadly, Percy knew that neither of the man's promises had ever come to pass. The memory ended, Percy finding himself kneeling on the crow's back. The flash had lasted a few seconds, but he hadn't been worried about plummeting to his doom. He'd already instructed the clone to take over the bird's body and keep them both safe whenever they tapped into a new memory. Right as Percy was about to ask Mickey how he was feeling, he saw the notification flashing before the clone's borrowed eyes. Congratulations! Your spell has evolved. Secret Art. Soul Harmony. Refined-Secret Art. Soul Symphony. Masterful. Weirdly enough, while Phoebe's decree had started letting Percy know whenever his familiar registered a new spell after absorbing Obatala's approval, the convenient feature didn't extend to his clones. Even so, he could read the messages while sharing their senses, and he knew the upgrade would get listed in his own status the next time the clone returned to his body. The grade of the spell didn't surprise him much either. The concept behind Soul Symphony wasn't very complicated, but it did require not only his bloodline, but 3 minds and several months of planning to work. Besides, Percy's secret art had already evolved once while retaining its refined classification, so it must have been close to the next tier to start with. Well, whatever. No time to worry about it. Percy shifted his attention to Mickey, though the crow beat him to the punch. It doesn't look like I ever saw him die, the bird said, some hope seeping into his voice. I know it's unlikely that he's still alive after all this time, but maybe there's a chance? Percy sighed, not sure what to tell his friend. In the end, he opted for honesty. It's possible. If they captured him instead of killing him, they might have taken him to a coliseum like the one I found you in, forcing him to fight for entertainment like you. But, Mickey, that was decades ago. And it might be several more decades before we're in any position to look for him. Feeling his familiar's optimism evaporating, Percy hated himself for saying those words, though he didn't regret them. It wasn't healthy for Mickey to delude himself with false hope. It would only make the eventual truth sting that much more. It was better to ground himself in reality. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to look for him, Percy added. No matter what, we'll do everything in our power to find out what happened to your father, Mickey. That much, I promise you. The crow nodded, though Percy could tell that his friend was still clinging to the unlikely possibility that his father was alive somewhere. Technically, there was a chance that the original Mickey had already learned what had happened to his father during his imprisonment on Huehue, but it didn't look like they would be restoring any more of the crow's forgotten memories with their current means. Even after strengthening their connection and playing dozens, if not hundreds of variations of Mickey's melody, digging out the memories had only grown harder. Percy knew they were still buried in there somewhere, but he would probably have to bring the crow to Melodia and request help from one of their soul healers before his familiar could recall the rest of his severed past. Shaking his head, Percy shifted his attention to the tall structure in front of him. It was a nostalgic mountain covered in enormous mushrooms, their glowing caps shrouded in mist that was no less colorful than the fungi themselves. At last, they had reached their destination. As much as Percy wanted to help Mickey, there was another soon-to-be familiar that required his support far more urgently than the crow. Percy took a deep breath, spending a moment to appreciate the familiar feeling of the colorful motes flowing toward him. It was hard to gauge their exact impact on his regeneration when his reserves were already full, but he estimated he could convert the ambient mana to his own affinities 20% faster than usual. The effect would be even more pronounced once he and Mickey crossed the final stretch separating them from the mountain. The environment here appeared to synergize better with the external part of his boosting art than circulation did. The motes changed to a bluish-gray color rather easily as they approached the burning wisps dancing around Percy's body, though some of them turned white instead when seized by the snowstorm spiraling around Mickey's. It's barely been 2 minutes, and I already want to stay here forever, Percy lamented, his lips curling into a bitter smile. Unfortunately, he couldn't afford to spend too long at this place. He had to leave as soon as his new clones were ready. Hopefully, he'd be able to return a couple of days later to grab the egg from the wasps before leaving again. But even that wasn't guaranteed to succeed. Shouldn't you be more worried about those elders right now? Mickey suddenly asked. I don't think we can handle even a single violet, let alone 5. Percy sighed. Of course I'm worried. But at the end of the day, they're alchemists and not fighters. Who knows how many centuries it's been since the last time any of them stretched their limbs. Besides, their job is mainly to manage the guild and guard the settlement, not to chase fugitives or babysit the starry commanders. Even if they've heard that we're heading toward the spire, I don't think they'll be expecting us on the 5th level. Mickey nodded, though the tension in the air was palpable. Percy wasn't exactly convinced by his own words either. As much as he wanted to reassure himself and his companions that everything would be okay, they all knew that there were a million things that could go wrong. Even worse, Nephthys was almost out of time. Percy had already asked Mickey to check up on the pyramid, and it wasn't doing great. The structure was covered in cracks, the goddess's lingering wisps slowly spilling out of the holes, shrinking by the hour. At this point, Percy wasn't even sure that he'd have time to look for a different body should he fail to grab one from the hive. But he'd already rushed here as fast as possible. Even after spending all those months training, he and Mickey had barely grown strong enough to handle the powerful groups they'd faced on the way. Attempting the mission any earlier would have only spelled their doom. Percy was debating internally whether it would be better for the Amenthei goddess if he aborted the infiltration entirely and searched for a different host while he still could, when he spotted a tiny dot on the horizon. It rapidly grew into the silhouette of a person, just one, flying straight toward them. What the hell? Discovered already? Please don't let it be one of the elders. Percy prayed silently, a frown marring his face. Upon closer inspection, he saw a faint blue glint in the newcomer's frame, causing him to exhale in relief. In fact, Percy recognized the man not long after, despite having only seen him once in his life. He was tall, sporting a head of dull gray hair, his gaze intense and intimidating, though not as much as it used to be. He wore expensive-looking robes, a series of roots emerging from the underside of a cloud on his insignia, indicating that he was a member of Remier's leading great house. For Percy, it had been over a decade since their last meeting. He hadn't known the Blue's name at the time, only learning it years later. Even so, the man had made quite the impression, as he had been one of the strongest mages Percy had encountered up to that point, falling short of just his grandfather. He was naturally Deimos, the son of Hermes, and the very envoy of the divine root who had sent Jason after Percy and Nesha. But why is he here by himself? He can't seriously think he can fight both of us without help. Or does he think that I'll spare him after all the crap he's put us through? Percy instinctively scanned his surroundings again, to make sure that Deimos was truly alone. After confirming that the Blue really was that stupid, Percy brandished his scythes, urging Mickey to rush toward their opponent. He knew the man had originally acted under orders from above, but Percy still wouldn't forgive Deimos for stripping Oren's status, imprisoning Archibald, and torturing both of them. Breaking them out of the guild wasn't possible just yet, and not without getting everyone into more trouble. However, avenging them wasn't out of the question, now that their captor had so foolishly offered himself up on a silver platter. This book is hosted on another platform. Read the official version and support the author's work. Hurling the weapons, Percy willed them to shatter into dozens of pieces each, the burning fragments repairing themselves into new scythes. He kept a pair to himself, jumping onto another. Percy's gaze sank into Deimos's frame, the clone's melody echoing in his soul as the crow appeared ready to attack. Killing a solitary Blue shouldn't be very difficult for them, no matter who it was. But Percy wasn't one to underestimate his opponents either. After all, he'd long lost track of all the mages who'd fallen by his hand after making that very mistake. A human and a bird closed into their target, though Deimos kept flying toward them at the same leisurely pace, seemingly unconcerned. "I knew you'd show up sooner or later," the Blue suddenly said, his voice oozing with ill-concealed mirth. "I'm still not sure whether you've come for your mentor, your grandfather, or just to steal more elixirs, as you seem to enjoy doing. But I never doubted that waiting for you here was the right call." Percy ignored the man's ramblings, intent on eliminating him as quickly as possible. A dozen scythes spun toward Deimos, their edges not even disturbing the glowing motes as they phased soundlessly through the air. The violent winds disturbed them plenty, however, icy shards carving narrow paths through the colorful mist as they shot toward the Blue from every direction. Not waiting to see if their attacks landed, Percy and Mickey were en route to meet Deimos, ready to finish him off if he somehow survived the barrage. To his great shock, Percy watched the Blue dodge the attacks rather easily, twisting his body through a narrow gap between them. A few of the projectiles still found their mark, only to shatter harmlessly on Deimos's skin. Clearly, cutting through the thick willpower wouldn't be easy. Luckily, Percy and Mickey were ready. The former swung his scythes personally this time, their tips about to sink into his opponent's neck. The crow was drilling a path behind Deimos, about to turn the man into minced meat the second he took even a single step back. The Blue surprised them yet again, spinning vertically to duck beneath the gray crescents aiming for his head, delivering a powerful kick on Mickey with his heel. The bird's left wing shattered as a result, but Deimos wasn't done. Before Percy even processed what had happened, Deimos landed a slap on his chest with his backhand, knocking the wind out of his lungs as the enchantments on his cloak flashed, trying to absorb the impact. Percy and Mickey were sent flying in opposite directions, though Deimos merely floated in the same spot, clearly not in a rush to chase after them. "The rest of Remir hasn't had the privilege of talking to you in person, as I have, so they don't understand the sheer extent of your audacity," the Blue said, shaking his head. "But I do. I know that you have zero respect for authority, that nothing is sacred or off-limits for you." Percy tuned out Deimos's words, still struggling to wrap his mind around the ease by which the Blue had dealt with their attacks and struck them back. Stepping on a pair of crossed shafts to arrest his momentum, Percy rubbed his bruised ribs with his forearm, checking up on his familiar. The crow had used his mana to stabilize his flight, his severed wing slowly growing back. Overall, the damage they had received wasn't that bad, but Percy was still shaken to his core. How is he doing this? Some sort of bloodline? I don't think he's used a single drop of mana, He knew that domains could turn tangible, of course, and that they could be shaped into some nasty attacks, but flying solely through one's willpower was quite difficult. It wasn't just a matter of producing enough force to support a person's weight. The problem was doing it for an extended period of time, while accelerating and decelerating rapidly. Until today, Percy hadn't thought it possible for a blue to wield their domain with such finesse, let alone while retaining enough spare willpower to fight back. As much as he despised the man, he had to admit that Deimos was the most talented blue he'd seen on Remir. At the very least, the space assassin wouldn't have survived the last attack. It doesn't matter. I don't have time to waste on this bastard, Percy reminded himself, his soul lighting up with resolve. Perhaps he and Mickey could beat Deimos once they figured out how his bloodline worked, but that would only give the other blues time to catch up. Or worse, the elders to crawl out of their labs and put an end to Percy's invasion. Besides, Deimos was the son of a god. There was a non-zero chance he possessed a blessing too, among other trump cards. No matter how Percy reasoned about it, his best course of action would be to go all out to end this quickly. Pouring mana into the tattoo on his chest, he forced the brown ink to seep into his bloodstream. The liquid reached his heart in an instant, causing it to beat loudly. Each violent thrum rattled his bones, causing his veins to bulge, his muscles to squirm, and his frame to swell with power. Already, the yellow Troll's Fury tattoo appeared as effective on him as the orange one had been before his advancement. However, the strain was a lot more manageable this time, thanks to the new mutation. Percy grinned, knowing that he could probably try a green one in the future, though that would have to wait. Shrugging, he pushed more phantom mana into his channels, forcing his boosting art to its new limit. He even asked the clone to add some additional soul-freezing mana into his spare networks, having more space for the resource than a second ago. Gray wisps flared around him erratically, dancing in wide arcs, almost in sync with the clone's symphony. Their mournful faces sang to the tune with renewed passion, their shrill cries filling the aerial battlefield. Mickey didn't let himself fall behind either. He might not have a potion or a tattoo to fall back on, but he still pulled in as much mana as his crystalline body could contain more, really, his frozen fresh cracking as plumes of white spilled forth, the howling winds joining the melody. Percy and Mickey circled around Deimos, a storm of icy shards and enchanted weapons doing the same. The scythes kept breaking and reforming into more copies, the few strips of cloth that Percy had inadvertently shed during Deimos's counterattack now drifting toward the weapons. They joined them, cloaking their ghostly wielders, forming a flock of armed phantoms that glared at the blue with cold disdain. Then they moved. Lifeless figures attacked Deimos from every direction, though Percy and Mickey kept their distance for the time being, intent on fighting more cautiously. The blue handled the situation just as well as before, dodging the charging phantoms with ease, still not drawing even a drop of mana from his core. Scythes spun toward him by the dozens, a rain of sharp icicles joining them, but neither the burning crescents nor the frozen projectiles ever came close to putting a scratch on him. Percy used every trick under the sun to land a blow. His thousand-fanged maw spanned a wide enough area to surround the blue once ready, and enough force to bite through the thick layer of willpower protecting him. Sadly, it took time to prepare, allowing Deimos to avoid it well in advance. Percy tried to suffocate the blue by slipping a few strands of silk through his defenses, hoping that his fifth parade would work just as well as it had done against the assassin, yet Deimos never allowed a single strip of cloth to approach. Every now and then, Percy resorted to his winding corridor technique, trying to cut off Deimos's escapes, but the blue's spatial awareness was downright frightening. He nimbly dodged all of Percy's blows, always landing a nasty counterattack in response, his hits leaving painful bruises beneath the phantom-woven cloak. At some point, Deimos began firing his own projectiles, blasts of concentrated willpower that Percy's dancing phantoms struggled to block. Several attacks landed on him and Mickey, leaving their bodies battered and aching. Just how the hell is he doing this? Does he have a bloodline that amplifies his domain? Percy cursed, nearly biting his tongue. The situation was even more ridiculous as he considered the quintet of blues he and Mickey had recently defeated, without even having to resort to his Troll's Fury tattoo. Granted, Their opponents hadn't been the most talented of their grade, but they had still probably possessed enough combined strength to keep a weak Violet busy for a while. It just didn't make sense that a lone blue would be capable of doing so well by himself. This was the kind of thing Percy would have expected to see on a greater spring like Thescala, yet Remir simply didn't have any elite disciples like the ones he and Kasserith had faced in the tournament, not to his knowledge, at least. Even if a second prodigy had emerged on his world unbeknownst to everyone, it wouldn't explain the sheer ease by which Deimos was handling him and Mickey. The man was still holding back too. Maybe he isn't, the crow suddenly suggested. What if there's some price he has to pay to fight like this? Percy raised an eyebrow, thinking that his friend might be on to something. Perhaps Deimos wasn't playing around as much as he appeared to. What if not using his mana was actually a requirement to strengthen his domain to this extent? Well, Percy sure hoped that was the case, since his Troll's Fury tattoo wasn't going to last much longer. He was about to risk everything into an all-out attack, when Deimos seized the initiative for a change. An ocean of ink spilled out of his body, covering a colossal sphere of space that contained Percy, Mickey, and all of their constructs. Suffice to say, Percy had never seen so much willpower gathered in one place. Then again, he hadn't had his sovereign's eye for that long either. You know, in the beginning, I wanted to wring the recipe out of you so badly. Not only was that my mission, the reason my superiors deployed me to the Alchemists Guild in the first place, it also aligned with my personal interests. After all, which Yellowborn wouldn't dream of a path to divinity? Deimos said, his voice reverberating through the domain in a manner that reminded Percy of Hermes' transmissions, albeit at a far smaller scale. But it's pretty clear that the gods don't care about getting the recipe from you anymore. Either they have already figured it out, or they don't mind waiting a bit longer for your mentor to spill the beans. And honestly, I'm done caring too, the blue continued. The air around Percy grew thicker, vibrating violently. To his horror, his scythes shattered one after the other, though the cloaked phantoms seemed to absorb the shocks a little better than the weapons. A grating noise ruptured his eardrums, causing him to wince, two warm trickles rolling down the sides of his face. His bones shook, though his armor and enhanced physique kept them from breaking. Mickey was doing even worse, his crystalline body cracking and regenerating constantly as he struggled to remain afloat. Waiting a decade is starting to sound like a small price to pay for the privilege of killing you with my own two hands. I wonder if Orin will feel the need to keep the knowledge to himself once you're dead. And what will Archibald think when your family's neighbors are no longer afraid to burn your house to the ground? Percy couldn't hear the shrill cries of his phantoms anymore, nor the howling winds around them. He knew that he partly had his damaged ears to thank for that, but Mickey's worked just fine, yet the only thing either of them could hear was a constant buzz. Except of course for the blues taunts that appeared to bypass Percy's disability entirely. Deimos's domain affected more than the physical world, however, somehow reaching into Percy's mind to stifle even the clone's symphony. Gritting his teeth, Percy forced the ambient mana to flow toward the fragmented weapons, igniting them. Restoring the army of phantoms was a struggle, but he knew he would need them if he wanted to end the fight before his boost expired. Mickey seemed to agree, doing his best to shake the hostile willpower off. Deimos smirked as he watched their desperate efforts. He aimed his palm at Percy, firing a storm of projectiles, forcing him to dodge by the skin of his teeth. The ink-colored blasts moved fast and blended into the same colored background extremely well. If that wasn't enough, Percy found it difficult to predict Deimos's movements. The blue wasn't using his mana, providing Percy with fewer channels of information to study. Not wanting to fall into his opponent's rhythm, Percy broke 3 of the leaves on his forearm, allowing the potent green mana to flood his body, relieving some of his fatigue. Stepping on a nearby pair of scythes, he began building momentum, circling around Deimos while dodging his attacks. Slowly, he increased his minions' numbers again, spreading them like a gray blanket around the battlefield, trying to block his opponent's vision. We just need to launch one powerful attack. That's all we need to take that bastard down, Percy thought. No matter how powerful he seemed, Deimos's soul was just as vulnerable as any other blues. A single strike would kill him, though there were two obstacles standing in Percy's way. The first was his opponent's speed. Even while enveloping the entire battlefield with his domain and firing a flurry of powerful attacks, Deimos appeared to have enough willpower left to maneuver extremely well. Thankfully, this was a relatively easy problem to solve. Percy was confident he could create an opening with Mickey's help. The second obstacle was greater. Deimos's defense was clearly difficult to breach. Percy wasn't sure any of his attacks would be powerful enough, except perhaps for his second parade. But he doubted he'd ever land that one against such an opponent. The next best thing was his soul-crushing needle, but it might never make it through the wall of willpower. It doesn't matter. If none of my attacks are good enough, then I'll just have to come up with a new one, he thought, turning to his companions. Give me as much soul-freezing mana as you can muster. Fast. We'll only get one shot. The tattoo would probably last a bit longer than that, but refueling his spare channels took time, and Percy didn't think he'd be able to charge multiple blasts. Mickey and the clone nodded through their connection, already borrowing his excess mana to fuse with their own. Percy had no space for it in his body, but he was about to make some. Moving the exotic resource along his arms, he shuddered as an indescribable chill seeped into his bones. The cold substance was much easier to bear after the ritual, but not when concentrated in a single body part. Percy's muscles and joints stiffened, the blood in his veins slowing to a crawl as his fingers grew numb. Some of the frigid resource spilled into his cloak, inadvertently activating a few of the adaptive enchantments in the unit cells. The wrong mana type twisted the shape of the fabric, distorting the intricate network of runes. What was normally an orderly weave of enchantments became unrecognizable, the cloth on Percy's sleeves now resembling a bunch of tattered rags, fluttering in the wind. He was forced to pour some of his phantom mana into the self-repairs to restore the cloak to its normal shape, the two mana types fighting a tug-of-war over ownership of the construct. Most of the soul-freezing ice flowed toward the weapon, however. Percy had discarded one of his scythes, clenching the other with both hands as he poured the substance into its shaft. Much like with his clothes, he pumped phantom mana into the construct as well, trying to keep its shape intact. As powerful as the soul-freezing ice was, he wouldn't be able to deliver it properly if the weapon fell apart. Not enough. Send me more, he told the clone as he emptied his spare channels. Over the next minute or so, Percy dodged Deimos's attacks while multiplying his phantoms and fueling his weapon. He was certain the scythe was humming with unprecedented power, though his damaged ears still couldn't register any sound besides a constant buzz, along with the blue's occasional words. Cold flames danced around the blade as a layer of gray frost formed over its surface, a row of jagged teeth made of ice sprouting along its burning edge. Only when Percy was certain that it couldn't contain another drop of mana did he stop, lifting his gaze toward his opponent. Here goes nothing, he thought, guiding the others toward Deimos. Mickey and the phantoms moved, closing into the relaxed blue. Seemingly unbothered, the man withdrew much of his domain, before sending a violent shockwave outward to fend off his attackers. Everyone got pushed back, many of the constructs breaking in the process. Still, Percy and his companions didn't give up. His surviving minions resumed their offensive, flowing toward Deimos like a tide of gray fabric, pushing against his domain with brute strength. The blue condensed his willpower into a bubble around his body, navigating the tumultuous ocean of magical silk and reinforced blades, blasting holes into the mourning figure's ranks in his effort to not drown among them. Mickey joined the fight with little regard over his safety, entire chunks of ice crumbling from his body as he clashed with Deimos's barrier to force him to stay put. Meanwhile, Percy continued to build up speed, jumping from one pair of shafts to the next, his empowered weapon held tightly in his grasp. His new technique was based on his soul-crushing needle, but the enchanted scythe should boost its penetrating force even further, the adaptive heating enchantments raising the lethality of the exotic mana. And Percy was going to deliver the blow himself to make sure it connected. Scanning the space carefully, he waited patiently for the clone to signal that Deimos had slowed down, the ghost army having finally overwhelmed him. Of course, the blue had still done an admirable job guarding his body from their scythes, and Percy knew this fleeting opening would be gone in a second. Even so, it was enough. Some of the phantoms moved aside to open a path for their master, as Percy shot toward his opponent. The colors in his vision blurred as he closed the gap in an instant. His scythe mere meters from Deimos's silver silhouette. This was it. Deimos was admittedly quite agile, but there simply wasn't enough room left for him to dodge as the dancing crowd swarmed him. Furthermore, Percy just couldn't imagine any blue blocking such a powerful attack. Carnival of the Savage Gods, Sixth Parade, Winter's Edge. He tried to yell, though no sound escaped his lips. Even so, he swung the weapon with all his might. The violent impact stopped Percy in his tracks. The enchantments on his cloak lit up to protect him from the shock, though he still felt like his arms had turned to mush, his previously numb palms suddenly registering a wave of searing pain. At the same time, the scythe exploded into shrapnel, clearly unable to withstand the blow. A small shard lodged itself beneath Percy's right eye, nearly blinding him as colors returned to the world, revealing the aftermath of the attack. Percy ignored the pain in his limbs, watching with bated breath for the result. His heart skipped a beat upon seeing Deimos hovering in front of him, alive and well, a sly smirk plastered all over his face. A gray shard covered in cracks was pinched between the man's thumb and index finger, its tip mere centimeters from his chest. Percy's eyes widened in horror as he realized that his opponent had actually survived the attack, blocking the most powerful spell he had ever unleashed with ease. Examining the man carefully, it wasn't very difficult to figure out how this had happened, however. Mana was finally flowing out of Deimos's core, blending with the willpower in his hand, dispelling Mickey's optimistic theory that this shouldn't be possible. If that wasn't bad enough, Percy finally understood why his opponent's domain was so much stronger than it had any right to be. It had nothing to do with a willpower-strengthening bloodline or any cheap tricks like that. The true reason was far simpler. A blue star was still glowing brightly in Deimos's sternum, but the mana flowing down his arm wasn't blue. The man's smirk widened into a proper grin. Grabbing his robe with his free hand, he tore a patch off his chest, revealing a set of bandages wrapped tightly around his core. Percy hadn't studied Remir's runes as well as the vaults, but these he recognized. After all, he'd used something similar in the past. Concealment runes. Beads of cold sweat formed on Percy's forehead, as he registered at last how dire the situation was. Deimos was a violet, and not just a weak violet with a common affinity that he and Mickey might be able to barely win against or flee from. No, he was a violet with a sound affinity, a composite mana type known primarily for its speed, and quite possibly a blessing too. That's the one. The horrified expression I've waited so long to see, Deimos exclaimed, his gleeful voice slamming into Percy along with a wave of violet mana and ink-colored willpower, piercing through his damaged ears like a series of needles. Percy was sent flying back, a bloody cough escaping his lips as his opponent continued. I have to admit, you've fought quite well. Far better than I could have ever expected from a blue, let alone a yellow. I suppose all those bounty hunters you've taken down weren't as useless as I thought. If I hadn't advanced 3 years ago, I would have probably died by now. Then again, I wouldn't have stayed in the guild waiting for you in that case. Hardly in a position to process the violet's words, Percy landed on something cold and hard, feeling it buckle under his weight. Through the connection to his companions, he could tell that it was his familiar who'd cushioned his fall, at the cost of another broken wing. The crow was already doing his best to carry him away from their dangerous opponent, relying mainly on the cold mana spiraling around him until his missing limb was done regenerating. Percy didn't hesitate to consume another 5 leaves from his tattoo, leaving less than half of his initial stash left. The potent life mana washed over his body, mending his cracked bones and restoring most of his fighting strength. Even so, he was under no illusion that they could win against Deimos. Percy and Mickey had overcome plenty of challenging situations in the past, but the current gap was simply too vast to bridge. After going all out, they'd barely forced their opponent to start using his mana. Clearly, their only option was to try and ditch him, as impossible as that seemed. The violet expelled a shocking amount of mana and willpower from his feet, visibly distorting the air behind him as he shot toward the fleeing bird. Luckily, I had the foresight to conceal my new grade, otherwise my superiors might have moved me to a different post. Sometimes, I can't help but wonder what they even expected from me. That I would just walk away with my tail tucked between my legs after getting humiliated by you over and over again? For half a decade? Or that I would sit around waiting for you to grow strong enough to kill me too? More fodder for your ascension. Deimos chuckled, but it sounded hollow. Percy moved all his surviving phantoms in the violet's path, supplementing them with strips of cloth that he tore off his sleeves. Ambient mana rushed to ignite them, repairing them into a fresh wave of specters as Percy desperately tried to slow his opponent down. The constructs piled onto the advancing sound mage, hugging him into a massive ball of gray silk. It barely lasted an instant before Deimos punched right through it, resuming the chase. Percy never stopped adding to the army, buying time for his familiar to escape. Mickey's wing was done regrowing a moment later, allowing him to pick up speed. But it wasn't enough. Deimos was hot on their tail, drawing nearer by the second. Once he was only a few dozen meters away, he swiped his right arm, sending a barrage of concussive blasts at Percy. Unlike the projectiles he had fired earlier, these contained a lot of mana to reinforce the dense willpower, flying faster than before. Each left holes on multiple phantoms before running out of power. The platoon of dancing specters that Percy had painstakingly produced got ripped apart in an instant. Still, he didn't give up, and neither did Mickey. More silk tore itself off the rest of his burning cloak, the enchanted cloth shrinking faster than Percy could regenerate it. His scythes broke and reformed into half-baked copies, as they joined the twisted phantoms and the swirling gales of cold wind flying behind Mickey. At the same time, Percy's mind raced to come up with a way out of their predicament, as was his heart, albeit with the instinctual understanding that there wasn't one. I'm not an idiot, you know. Everyone with half a brain must have realized by now that the gods have your back. Of course they do. There's never been another monster like you on our world. Deimos's voice boomed again, his smirk fading as his tone grew colder. The rest of us mean nothing to them. My own father didn't even bother to stop me from hunting you. If anything, he's fine tossing me aside like garbage. Just another target dummy for you to practice on. But he isn't here to save you now, is he? None of them are. Is this it? Don't tell me I have to resort to that, Percy thought, fear gripping his heart. More shots continued to pierce his constructs, the barrage already about to reach Mickey. Gritting his teeth, Percy grabbed the nearest pair of scythes, standing as firmly as he could on the crow's back, ready to try his best to intercept the attacks. The shafts rolled along his limbs, his joints bending and twisting in unnatural angles as the crescent blades turned into gray blurs. The projectiles smashed the scythes into powder, many of them having enough strength left to punch through the structural integrity enchantments on Percy's tattered robe, leaving his flesh purple and swollen. Still, he persisted, drawing more scythes from his surroundings. For 1530. Each construct barely withstood a single hit, most of them not even that, as Percy scrambled to minimize the damage he and his familiar received. The weapons got replaced the moment they broke, a zone of gray snakes forming around Percy, slithering to their deaths to protect him and Mickey. You could be reading stolen content. Head to Royal Road for the genuine story. This was Percy's third parade, the Serpent's Den. Under other circumstances, he would have been ecstatic to see that his enhanced physique and the lingering influence of his Troll's Fury tattoo had allowed him to reproduce the technique in his own body. Sadly, this wasn't a great time for celebration.
Eskachkem.
Left with no other choice, Percy reached into the deepest recesses of his mind, willing Metatron's decree to activate. Soon, the last of the phantoms barring Deimos's path got torn to shreds, once again revealing the violet's cruel figure. A powerful blast shattered Percy's remaining scythes, drilling into his barely clothed sleeve with enough force to pulverize his elbow in a burst of blood and bone fragments. Luckily, the few leaves remaining in Percy's tattoo had been drawn on his upper forearm, barely surviving the brutal amputation. He consumed all 7 of them while he still could, though most of the life mana rushed to seal the stump, stopping the bleeding before Percy's brain even registered the pain of his missing limb. Open a second portal in front of you just in case, Percy ordered the clone. The first one was meant for Deimos to fall through. Given the man's momentum, they might be able to send him to the vault by himself if they got lucky. Opening the gate on Remir wasn't something Percy had ever wanted to do, but forcing their otherwise insurmountable opponent there was the best-case scenario under these circumstances. However, there was a good chance Deimos might dodge the portal in time, leaving them no option but to enter the second one themselves. Percy really hoped it wouldn't come to that. He had no idea what surrendering his main body to Metatron might mean for him and Mickey or Nephthys for that matter, or Nesha, Elaine, Archibald, and the rest of his world. Hell, he didn't even know if he'd ever get a chance to see Sol or Zoras again, or if he'd be able to free his other friends from the vault once he joined them. It doesn't matter. Most of these people will be screwed anyway if we die here. The priority now was to survive. Everything else they could worry about later. Deimos prepared another barrage as Percy waited with bated breath for the space in front of him to twist, and the familiar colors of the artificial world to pop into existence. "Come on, do it faster," he begged, the distortion taking an awful lot longer than usual to manifest. The violet's soul flared with unconcealed malice as his arm shone with raw power, yet the portal was nowhere to be found. Only then did Percy realize that something was wrong. "It won't activate," the clone's panicked voice said, echoing the same issue. Some unknown influence appeared to have blocked Metatron's decree entirely, leaving them stranded, and at their opponent's non-existent mercy. Even this most dreaded trump card that Percy had reserved for the worst-case scenario, the same move that had saved his ass twice in the past, had somehow been taken from him when he needed it the most. Mickey spun all the way, tossing his passenger off to protect him from the incoming missiles. Percy plummeted toward the ground, watching with horror as his familiar body got pelted by a rain of destruction, shattering into a dozen pieces. The crow had guarded his head and torso as best as he could, barely leaving his vitals intact. He'd lost both wings in the process, however, along with the lower half of his body, talons, tail feathers, all of it. Drawing what little mana he had left, Percy tried to regrow enough silk to arrest his momentum, though his still landed rather painfully on the hard dirt, leaving a deep crater and raising a cloud of dust. Mickey hit the ground next to him even harder, what little was left of his frame now riddled with cracks. As for Deimos, he landed gracefully a few meters away, the colorful motes in the area illuminating the savage grin on his expression. Only now did Percy register that the sun had set at some point during the battle, the moonlit sky suffusing the battlefield with its faint glow. The violet walked leisurely and soundlessly toward Percy, his suffocating domain causing the ringing in his skull to intensify. "I'm sorry our adventure had to end so soon, Percy?" Mickey's strained voice barely echoed in Percy's mind, speaking words that he'd never wanted to hear. "I want you to know that I'm grateful for the second chance you've given me. It wasn't always perfect, but it was more than most people in the universe could ask for. Even if we never got to achieve all of our goals, we had a lot of fun together. I'm glad I met you. No, we aren't done yet. I'm sure we'll find a way out of this. We always do." Percy tried to scream, but the sounds still refused to leave his mouth, even as his throat ached with despair. He tried to stand too, but his legs wobbled, a wave of weakness keeping him stuck to the ground as the Troll's Fury tattoo's lingering influence finally left his muscles. "The gods might think highly of you, but they aren't here to save you. I'm sure they'll be unhappy about your death. But this can't be blamed on me. After all, I'm only doing what they've allowed me to do. If they wanted you alive so badly, maybe they should have paid more attention," Deimos said, uncaring about their inner turmoil. The violet raised his hand toward Percy, torrents of mana gathering in his palm. "Once you're gone, guess who will suddenly earn some overdue attention? I'd always deserved it too. I'm more talented than half the Greenborns in the Order. My strength never mattered to the gods before, because I was doomed to remain a mortal my whole life. It was supposed to be different after the Aurora Dew came along. but they were too busy gawking over you. Well, it's going to be different as soon as your yesterday's news. Goodbye, Percy, the crow said, his voice sounding warm and sincere. The rest of Remir only knew Mickey as the monstrous bird that had devoured dozens of powerful mages. A statue of living ice that couldn't be reasoned with. But Percy knew the truth about his friend. Mickey had always been a gentle soul, someone who would rather die than to give his body up to a wicked person. Even after losing his memories, the crow had chosen to suffer in Acton's hands instead of laying a single talon on the innocence of Goldenfield Town. Whether it was the gladiator or the familiar, Mickey had only ever wanted to spend time with his friends and family, to free his enslaved people and travel by Percy's side, flying, training, and laughing together. The crow used what little mana he had left to leap in the way of the blast aimed at Percy. The latter's blood froze in his veins, the world slowing to a standstill as he felt his friend's skull break, the last spot in his body still hiding flesh. Ice, gore, and almost transparent blood splattered across the dirt and all over Percy's face, as the crow's headless torso fell limp in front of him with a muted thud. His eyes remained glued on his friend's cores. The blizzard of ambient mana spinning around them didn't show any sign of stopping. If anything, it only seemed to intensify, giving Percy hope that Mickey could still recover from a missing brain. That hope died the following instant, however, as a notification flashed before Percy's eyes, making him curse having Phoebe's decree for the first time in his life. Your familiar has been destroyed. Mictlantecuhtli. You don't have to look so sad about the bird. I'll be sending you to join your little beast soon enough, Deimos said, his mocking voice slamming into Percy's skull with savage glee. Of course, Percy couldn't care less about the violet's threats or insults at the moment. All he could manage was a blank stare at his friend's mutilated carcass. He tried his utmost to disregard the status's morbid notification as he prayed for the crystalline body to start regenerating. Something shifted, causing his heart to skip a beat. Sadly, it soon became clear that it was just the wisps trying to return further, evidenced by his cords shaking violently, as they often did when a clone was on the way back. The first and oldest among them was located just below Percy's sternum, the other a bit lower. Sure enough, a blob of silver and gray soon left Mickey's body, shooting toward Percy. It slammed into his chest, the wisps trying to burrow into the spots they'd been severed from. Only things didn't go very smoothly this time. Mickey had been a familiar, not a clone. The part of Percy's soul inside him had already merged with the stillborn crow's and fallen gladiator's souls a long time ago, making the resulting wisp slightly foreign to Percy. To complicate things further, the barrier of phantom mana that the clone normally used to keep himself separate from Mickey had collapsed upon their death, causing the two wisps to mix on the way back. The gloomy blob wanted to enter Percy's body through two different wounds. As a result, it pulled and twisted his soul, threatening to rip him apart from within and plunging him into a world of untold agony. Gritting his teeth, he ignored the pain, trying to savor the ocean of memories rushing into his head. There were countless times more memories than any of his previous clones had ever brought back. They flashed before Percy's eyes too rapidly for him to process, though he scarcely registered that they spanned his friend's whole life on Remir, from the day he hatched, all the way to his death. In many of them, Percy saw himself through the crow's eyes, experiencing Mickey's feelings and reliving much of their shared past from a new perspective. His eyes burned, welling with tears as the back of his mouth tasted bitter. A pit formed in his stomach, his head pounding from the influx of information, turning his thoughts groggy and impossible to sift through. Even so, he tried his best to claw himself back to the present moment. Lifting his gaze with difficulty, he saw Deimos's blurry silhouette preparing another blast to finish him off, though he was certainly taking his sweet time. Clearly, the sadistic bastard was enjoying himself. Is he grinning? It was hard to tell for sure, but that sounded right in line with what Percy had seen of the Violet's personality. Cold fury burned through Percy's veins as he tried to get back up and fight Deimos to the very end. He knew he'd probably lose, but he owed Mickey to die on his feet, trying to avenge him. Unfortunately, Percy's muscles refused to so much as twitch. Something else did twitch, however. Once again, the movement came from the crow's shattered carcass, which should have gone completely inert by now. Percy couldn't help but raise an eyebrow upon realizing that the blizzard of ambient mana spiraling around the cores had only intensified instead of dying down. What they? He didn't even get to complete his thought when the icy body exploded soundlessly, sending frozen fragments everywhere. Most of them didn't really matter, but the two intact orbs shooting toward Percy did. One shone in an amber light, the other pale green and yellow in his mana sense. They landed onto the torn fabric, trying to regenerate on his chest, sinking into the shifting strips of silk. The cold storm followed right behind them, collapsing upon Percy. Deimos must have fired his spell, judging by the lingering traces of violet mana fading around his hand, though Percy hadn't even seen the projectile. Thankfully, he hadn't felt the blow either, his head still attached to his shoulders. The only explanation was that something had blocked the attack, but he wasn't sure what. The wisps danced wildly around him, carving burning trails in their path. They blended with the frigid winds to form a twisting cyclone, strips of silk and chunks of ice, joining them into a chaotic maelstrom of gray mana. The pain in Percy's soul intensified, his flesh now beginning to fight against him too. Soul-freezing ice rushed into his spare channels with renewed vigor, some of the substance even spilling out of the pathways to reach other body parts. It slowed down the flow of blood in his veins, sending an uncomfortable chill deep into his bones. His muscles squirmed as the cold found its way into his other mana networks, causing even his soul to grow brittle. Tendrils spread out from the blob still roiling on his chest, expanding like roots to fill every corner of Percy's body. It felt like his very being was restructuring itself, in a manner far more intrusive than even when he'd absorbed his third trait. You could be reading stolen content. Head to the original site for the genuine story. The pain intensified further, leaving Percy unable to think about anything else. If it hadn't been for the blessing of permanence, the insomnia trait, and the decades of experience he'd had experimenting with his soul, he would have passed out already. Even with all those accolades under his belt, he soon found himself unable to hold on, his consciousness receding into the confines of his mind. Suspended within a vast, gloomy ocean, a single structure was spinning slowly. It was shaped like a pyramid, sporting a deep crimson color. The object had certainly seen better days. Its formerly smooth surfaces were now riddled with cracks, its previous radiance having dimmed greatly. The interior was in an even worse condition. The symbols on its ceilings and walls were distorted and faded, to the point that even their authors would have struggled to read them. The rich history they'd once depicted now lost to the annals of time. Many souls lay slumbering within the pyramid, though they were smaller than grains of sand by now, tiny sparks of silver on the verge of going out. Even the much larger wisp embracing them all, the very owner of the structure and the one responsible for the other's survival, wasn't doing much better than her people. Like everyone else, she was asleep, her damaged soul having slowly leaked out of the cracks over the past few years, leaving barely a fraction of its original volume left. But there was something else here, besides the slumbering souls. A desert of colorless powder littered every floor in the structure, filling the rooms and corridors closer to its base entirely. The quantity of the exotic substance was so great that a single mortal would have needed decades, if not centuries, of restless consumption to exhaust it all. Some of it had been used up over the past few months, and it had even happened a little faster than normal. Still, most of the dust was inside the pyramid, showing no signs of running out anytime soon. Or at least that had been the case until now. Seemingly out of the blue, the scattered dust ignited, transparent flames spreading through the structure. For the first time in hundreds of thousands of years, the powder began evaporating at a frightening rate. Colorless plumes spilled out of the holes in the pyramid's walls with such force that they even drowned out the leakage of the goddess's soul for a while, buying her a little more time. But neither she, nor the person responsible for this development had the slightest clue that this was happening. In fact, seeing the powder consumed so quickly would have shocked every single god in the universe. For better or worse, however, there was nobody here to witness the change. When Percy came to, the pain was still there, though it was slightly more bearable. He found himself resting face down on a pile of snow, the cold wind sending a shiver down his spine. More importantly, he finally had enough strength in his body to move around. Getting up, he noticed that his surroundings looked quite familiar. A vast, snowy plain expanded in every direction, mostly flat with the occasional mound, a moonless sky stretching over his head. Many places in the universe probably fit that description, but Percy had only felt this cold a few times in his life, and most had occurred while experiencing another's memories of a certain planet. The dark side of Huehue. Unlike his previous visits, flashes of colorful lightning lit the sky up, drawing faint images upon the dark clouds that Percy was only now noticing. Whenever the heavens rumbled, the same pictures burned themselves directly into his head. He wasn't even done assimilating the crow's life yet, when a new tale sprung into his tired mind. This one was about a young boy who had spent his early days scavenging for food alongside his parents and sister, struggling to survive the harsh weather of his world. Later, it told of the boy's separation from his family, and his relocation to a new home, one that was simultaneously warmer and far, far colder. Finally, the images depicted the young man's struggles to keep himself alive as he fought countless battles, suffering for the entertainment of his treacherous kinsman. It's too much. Percy was forced to bury his face in the snow, desperate to cool his head off. The first set of memories had already been almost impossible to endure. He sure hadn't been ready to absorb another. There was simply no way he could possibly process all this information by himself. Luckily, it didn't seem like he was by himself. A crunching sound caused him to jerk his head to the right. He saw a person approach, his silhouette familiar. He wore nothing but a pair of shorts, a series of tribal tattoos faintly visible on his bare chest and forearms. His features were mostly humanoid, except for a mouth and nose fused into a long beak, and short, dark hair that resembled the fluff one might see on a newborn sheik. It had been a long time since Percy saw this person's appearance reflected by the murky pond in his cell, and through the man's own eyes at that. Even so, there was no mistaking him. With every step the newcomer took, Percy's heart thrummed violently, causing the entire plane to shake. The memories grew easier to bear too, almost as if somebody was helping him carry the burden. More sounds reached Percy's ears, making him appreciate that he could finally hear something other than Deimos's grating voice, or the irritating ringing of the Violet's domain. The shrill cries of Percy's phantoms filled the air, mourning one's untimely death. Winds howled furiously, promising vengeance on the one responsible, as a murder of crows cawed excitedly, seemingly celebrating their upcoming feast. Percy had no idea if the savage melody was coming from the real world, or merely his own mind. He wasn't even sure that the two were mutually exclusive. There was another, gentler tune. Anyone but Percy would have probably missed it. How could they not? Like a soft whistle, it spoke of a simpler time, reminding him of happier days, of a past he cherished greatly. The four-armed man drew nearer, stopping by Percy's side. He extended his lower right arm, offering to help him upright as the music reached its crescendo. Its triumphant notes resonated with Percy's thoughts, singing of victory against impossible odds and the reunion of old friends. What the hell is going on? Deimos couldn't help but ask himself, halting his barrage upon realizing that his spells weren't going to get through the cyclone. A bad premonition forming at the corner of his mind. The Redborn hadn't moved a single step, to the point that it wasn't even clear whether he was still conscious in there. The gray maelstrom protecting him was weird enough, but Deimos was more perplexed by the strange melody permeating the battlefield. Leaving aside the fact that he couldn't even pinpoint where the crows were cawing from, he knew that nothing should have been audible inside his domain without his explicit permission. Peering past the dark gales spiraling around his opponent, he tried to make sense of the changes. Torrents of mana rushed to fuel the enchantments on Percy's equipment, his cloak appearing to have reached a new equilibrium. Two distinct mana types seemed to be at play, the same ones that the human and his pet had wielded separately, though they now flowed in perfect sync, like two parts of a greater whole. Deimos couldn't name either of them, though one most closely resembled ice mana, if he ignored how freely it shifted between solid, liquid, and gas. This affinity appeared to have a destructive effect on the construct, constantly distorting its weave as its sibling, some variant of soul mana, surely fought to preserve the cloak's shape. The cloth coiling around Percy resembled a beggar's rags more than anything a noble would wear. The cloak was longer than before, covering almost every square centimeter of the Redborn's body, its ends fluttering wildly in the wind. The occasional strip of silk tore itself off to join the blizzard, as more fabric grew to replace it. At this point, it was honestly difficult to tell where the construct ended and the frigid storm began. Regardless, Percy had remained perfectly still, making Deimos question whether the young man was even alive. The fool! Did he freeze himself to death with his own spell? He wondered with a faint smirk, finding the notion amusing. Still, he knew he couldn't leave this place without making sure. It would only bring him trouble later. Walking closer to the edge of the cyclone, Deimos looked deep into the dark depths of his opponent's hood, the one spot on his body that wasn't entirely covered. He was trying to discern whether there was any flesh left on the Redborn's face, when something happened that made him leap back in fright. Two pale orbs looked right back at Deimos, their piercing gaze stabbing into his very soul. The maelstrom exploded outwards in a tide of cold air, forcing Deimos to shield himself with a layer of willpower. The chill sent a tingle down his spine, the frigid wind licking his skin like a devil's tongue. Swallowing hard, he scarcely noticed that all the colorful motes for hundreds of meters had suddenly turned gray, gathering around the cloaked figure like a swarm of forsaken fireflies. The Redborn raised his one remaining arm, a small shard shooting toward his palm from the ground nearby, growing into a complete scythe by the time it landed in his grip. The sight made Deimos's heart race with terror, though he forced himself to calm down. "I've no idea how you managed to create a barrier powerful enough to block my magic, but you should have kept playing dead inside your little cyclone until I grew bored and left," he shouted, aiming his palm at his opponent and firing a dozen powerful blasts. This time, he was going to make sure the bastard died, to prevent any nasty surprises down the line. His eyes widened the very next instant, however, as the Redborn's hand moved with such speed that his weapon turned into a blur, slicing and smashing through each of the deadly projectiles with chilling ease. Impossible, Deimos thought. Seeing and reacting to the rapid barrage would have been shocking enough, but those feats admittedly fell within the realm of Percy's known abilities. What was far less believable was that a single one of his constructs could withstand so much force without breaking. During their earlier battle, the Redborn had struggled to stop his spells. Of course, Deimos still had no clue what had happened to his opponent, but Percy's grade hadn't really changed. Even though he was somehow wielding his crow's cores, his constructs were still mostly permeated by dense, yellow mana, except for a few green lines branching out inside his cloak. And those didn't even extend to the weapons in the first place. Clearly, Percy hadn't had the chance to upgrade the enchantments on the scythe either, so it just didn't make sense that it could bear the strain. Racking his brain, Deimos could only think of a single explanation, though it wasn't that much easier to accept. Then again, it would also explain how the strange melody had pierced through his willpower, its eerie tune echoing through the battlefield. A domain? If the Redborn had truly awakened one, it wasn't the entry-level domain that blues acquired upon advancing either. This one was clearly no weaker than Deimos's own. /empty said yes. The story has been illicitly taken. Should you find it on Amazon, report the infringement. Realizing that things had just taken a turn for the worse, Deimos unleashed a lot more mana, pelting the Redborn with a hail of transparent projectiles, each deadlier than the last. The scythe continued to hold, though its wielder finally got pushed back by the relentless barrage, allowing Deimos to exhale in relief. Evidently, his opponent's unexpected power-up wasn't without its limits. Sadly, his joy was short-lived. The cloaked figure moved again, lifting what was left of his severed arm, a rush of gloomy motes sinking into the empty sleeve. Bursting out of the opening, a skeletal hand shimmering in a gray light emerged, a layer of frost filling the gaps between the bones with artificial flesh. Before Deimos even registered what was happening, another shard shot toward the Redborn, a second scythe settling into his grip. The cloaked figure danced with eerie grace, stepping, pivoting and spinning atop the frozen ground as he steadily advanced. Gritting his teeth, Deimos backtracked to give himself more space, pumping mana out of his channels until his arms hurt, desperately trying to keep his inhuman opponent at bay. The Redborn wasn't nearly done yet, it seemed. Each of his sleeves split in two, the top halves soon regenerating as the lower halves coiled around a new pair of crystalline arms holding just as many scythes. The cloaked figure darted toward Deimos, the missiles of compressed sound barely slowing him down. Shafts rolled freely along the Redborn's now 4 limbs, pivoting around his elbows, a flurry of gray crescents shredding through every projectile heading his way. Deimos keenly noticed that his opponent's skill had shot through the roof the moment his new arms took shape. The difference this time had been more than quantitative. It felt as if the Redborn's fighting style had always been meant for a person with 4 hands. Either way, Deimos didn't have time to worry about that. Seeing that his opponent's scythes were mere meters away from slicing through his very soul, he gritted his teeth, expending his mana lavishly to shoot dozens of blasts at once, hoping for an opening. No matter how impregnable the Redborn's defenses seemed, Deimos knew that a single hit would be enough to turn the bastard's fragile body into a pile of goo. Sure enough, the cloaked figure managed to parry most of the blows, but his scythes could only be in so many places at once. Deimos grinned as he watched one of the projectiles fly past the constructs, about to dig into Percy's hood, to burst his skull open like a rotten watermelon. Time seemed to slow down to a crawl as something unexpected happened. At the last moment, the fabric at the top and bottom of the Redborn's hood shifted, almost as if it had a mind of its own. It turned into a pair of pointed tips, clamping down on the missile like an elongated beak, scattering it into a bunch of harmless motes. The smile froze on Deimos's face as he finally accepted that he wasn't going to win the brawl. Stomping hard, he released another hefty chunk of mana, propelling himself upwards. The next moment, he found himself hovering hundreds of meters off the ground, looking down at his opponent. "I admit that I don't stand a chance on solid ground," he yelled, projecting his voice through his domain. As much of it as was left, anyway, since the massive bubble of willpower had shrunk greatly, gnawed down to a mere fraction of its size by the raging blizzard. Regardless, Deimos wasn't one to give up so easily. "I can't help but wonder whether you can move this well without proper footing." Silently accepting his challenge, the cloaked figure jumped after him, opening his beak wide. Torrents of ambient mana spiraled into his dark throat, causing his shape to swell. Gray silk expanded over his frame, rippling over his arms like a river to form a pair of giant wings. Before long, the Redborn was no smaller than an elephant, resembling a crow more than he did a human. In fact, he looked just like his dead pet, save for the different texture and color of his body. But it didn't seem like he was done yet. The cloak continued to expand, soon reaching the size of a small house. The sight reminded Deimos of the blue wasps he'd seen on the 5th level of the fungal spire, though the Redborn only kept growing. He didn't stop until he was as large as what Deimos could only describe as a violet beast, though he'd obviously never actually seen one. Flapping its humongous wings, the monstrous crow crossed the gap in an instant, its beak opening wide around him, large enough to swallow a man whole. Deimos ignored the horrid sight of its cavernous throat, and the rows upon rows of curved fangs pointing at him, each as big as a scythe's blade. He barely managed to escape to the side as the beak clamped shut with enough force to send a ripple down the bird's silken flesh, broken fangs shooting in every direction. Deimos hadn't escaped unscathed, however. Glancing down, he saw that his left leg had been severed just above the ankle, a layer of gray frost sealing the wound as it slowly spread toward his knee, a wave of numbness reaching all the way to his thigh. Still, Deimos ignored the discomfort, seizing the opportunity to land a devastating blow on his opponent. Rolling and sliding down the abomination's body, he clung to one of the creases near its chest to arrest his momentum, shooting a new barrage of powerful missiles. He aimed them at the green star thrumming somewhere in the construct's depths. The 3 yellow cores were impossible to locate amidst the ocean of same-colored mana, but this one constantly betrayed its location. As long as he shattered it, the Redborn spell was bound to come undone. Things didn't go to plan. At first, the blows barely left a dent on the cloth, forcing Deimos to put more effort behind each one. Eventually, he managed to tear a few holes into the silk, but the substance was regenerating too fast for him to ever reach his target. And it appeared he was out of time already. The giant crow rolled once through the air, shaking him off. A colossal wing wider than a building slammed into Deimos like a meteor, snapping most of his ribs in half and causing his right arm to bend the wrong way. A mouthful of red snow escaped his lips, and then another as he collided against something hard, leaving several deep craters covered in cracks while skidding across the ground. By the time Deimos came to a halt, his whole body was a mess, though it didn't look like his opponent had any intention of letting him catch his breath. Lifting his gaze, he watched the colossal crow dive toward him, the tips of its sharp talons glinting with fury. Deimos rolled to the side just in time to avoid getting flattened like a bug beneath the giant talon, thick plates of stone flipping as the earth split under the crow's bulk. A second talon descended almost immediately after, though he luckily managed to avoid it too, the shockwave sending him flying away. Opening its beak wide, the bird drew even more ambient mana. His body couldn't grow any larger, so it swelled into a sphere instead, before exploding. A murder of regular-sized crows emerged from within, flying furiously toward Deimos. Pushing himself to his remaining foot, he used his domain to force his bones back in place, wincing through the pain as he braced himself for the incoming flock. Firing countless projectiles, he destroyed as many of the artificial creatures as he could, the rest dodging the blasts as they prepared for a second attack. A few lodged themselves into the ground, their figures bursting open to reveal a series of cylindrical shafts. The constructs grew into full-sized scythes as the silk flowed around them, rolling into humanoid shapes that promptly lifted their weapons off the ground. The cloaked phantoms danced around Deimos, their shrill cries grating at his ears as the crows above shadowed their movements, surrounding him. His domain shrunk further as the savage tune intensified, his very willpower turning brittle and shattering like cheap glass. Not caring about the domain, Deimos focused on the countless constructs about to rip his soul to shreds. He knew he couldn't possibly stop or dodge each of them separately, especially since they appeared far sturdier than they had during his earlier battle with Percy. Left with no other choice, he clapped his hands together, emptying more than half of his reserves, a powerful shockwave expanding outwards like thunder to rip the phantoms apart. His troubles had only just begun, however. The shards flew toward the last of the cloaked figures, who Deimos could only assume was their master. The Redborn lifted his one good arm, the storm converging into his hand. The pieces attached themselves to one another, held in place by frost and enchanted silk, a new construct slowly taking shape. It was a massive weapon, its shaft thicker than a tree's trunk, stretching out for over 100 meters. Unable to hold it in his hand, the Redborn wrapped his elbow around it, a series of long blades sprouting along its length. He'd probably intended them to curve into neat crescents, but their actual shape ended up jagged. Each resembled a rough shard of ice more than a scythe's blade, though there was no doubt as to their sharpness, making the whole structure look like an oversized cleaver. An outside observer might have burst out laughing at the comical sight of the regular-sized human trying to wield what could only be described as the ugliest pole on Remir. Deimos swallowed hard, knowing better. Without warning, the Redborn swung his deceptively practical weapon, the construct appearing entirely weightless as it completed its arc in half a heartbeat. Deimos barely managed to hop high enough to avoid getting cleanly bisected, though a gray crescent still sliced through his knees before expanding outwards, the gray motes parting as a new layer of frost rippled across the battlefield. Not a drop of blood leaked from his stumps, chips of brittle flesh flaking off one after the other. Deimos wasn't given the chance to so much as study his debilitating injury, the Redborn already swinging his monstrous weapon again, this time vertically. Unlike before, Deimos managed to avoid getting hit, watching with horror as the cleaver sliced the ground open into a deep ravine, revealing countless tunnels covered in colorful crystals. Like withering flowers, the vibrant minerals soon lost their hues. A gloomy layer of gray sealing the caverns as waterfalls of hissing mist poured down the bottomless chasm. Realizing that his opponent was about to attack a third time, Deimos unleashed every drop of mana he had left, parrying the blow at the last instant. Surviving the execution by the skin of his teeth, he was sent sliding backwards, digging a deep trench in the process. The narrative has been illicitly obtained. Should you discover it on Amazon, report the violation. The collision had thankfully damaged the cleaver too, though its wielder didn't appear very concerned. Tossing the broken weapon aside, the cloaked figure formed another in his hand, just a regular scythe this time. Walking toward Deimos, the Redborn dragged its tip along the ground, the grating noise causing Deimos's hair to stand on end. The pale orbs within the hood still shone brightly, their frigid gaze never peeling off Deimos's frame for even a second as he finally realized that he was going to die here. As strange as it seemed, this was the one outcome that he hadn't really considered over the past few years. He understood that Percy was growing at a ridiculous pace, of course, and that the gods were probably deeply invested in his development. Even so, none of that had mattered to him that much. Ever since his advancement to Violet, he thought that he still had decades, if not centuries, before the Redborn caught up to him. After all, he hadn't broken any rules. He was under no obligation to disclose his new grade to anyone, and it wasn't his fault that his superiors wanted to throw blues at Percy by the dozens to foster his growth, without so much as informing them of the boy's importance. If there had been a few things that had kept him awake at night, they had nothing to do with his survival. He'd stressed over whether Percy would foolishly return to the guild and fall into his trap, whether Orin would spill the beans on the Aurora Dew and give him the means to attain divinity, and whether Hermes would finally acknowledge his talent after he personally defeated Remir's reigning prodigy. As for his safety, until this moment, Deimos had never even bothered to question it. Yet, watching the very face of death approach, his eyes widened with horror as he finally came to terms with what he'd done. He'd driven Percy out of the Alchemist's Guild and his family's mansion, dragged his name through the mud, sent countless bounty hunters after his head, captured his grandfather and locked him up in a cell, stripped his mentor's status and humiliated him publicly, threatened his loved ones, mocked him, and even killed his beloved crow in front of his eyes, all the while laughing and joking about it.
Ni vita.
Beads of sweat froze on Deimos's forehead as his executioner stopped just a step away, looming over him like the Grim Reaper. Not a hint of mercy could be found in his cold gaze. And why would it? Deimos had slapped the devil's cheek time after time, spat into his eyes, and then had the gall to invite him over for tea. And now, said devil was here to extract his payment. Swinging his scythe, the Redborn allowed the crescent blade to phase through the ground, stabbing through Deimos's chest from behind. A curved edge tore through his flesh and soul both, lifting him a few centimeters off the ground as an indescribable chill spread out from the wound. There was no pain, just numbness, darkness seeping through the corners of his vision. He scarcely registered his core falling apart, its pieces hungrily devoured by the blade. A layer of gray frost encased it, reshaping the construct into a tall stalagmite. Tearing the shaft off the impaled corpse, they left Deimos's lifeless body on display. A warning to anyone foolish enough to provoke somebody they shouldn't. A deep rumble shook the earth, as the status finally broke its silence. Congratulations! Your spells have merged. Secret Art, Soul Symphony, Masterful plus Secret Art. Soul Crushing Needle, Masterful plus Spectral Art. Phantom Woven Cloak, Masterful plus Wild Art. Carnival of the Savage Gods, Masterful plus Wild Art. Symbol of the Savage Gods, Masterful dash. Ultimate Art. Symphony of a Dead Winter Extreme. Falling to their knees, they couldn't help but raise an eyebrow, though they were unfortunately way too tired to make sense of the message right now. Besides, the status wasn't even done. Error. Unable to identify user. Calibrating Phoebe's decree. At the same time, the tremor intensified, countless shapes seemingly moving underground. Much of the noise appeared to emanate from the bottomless ravine a few dozen meters away, cracking sounds permeating the area, almost as if an entire army of monsters was crawling over the crystalline walls, rapidly climbing to the surface. Wholly uninterested in their predicament, Phoebe's decree continued. Calibration complete. Congratulations! You have acquired a new aspect. Percival! Congratulations! You have acquired a new aspect. Mictlantecuhtli! They felt something worm its way to their chest, ripping itself from the tattered robe. A dark object landed on the frozen ground with a crisp ting. It was a bird. Whether it was its size or color, it looked no different from a mundane crow. However, its gray body was clearly still made of ice, a green and a yellow core pulsing inside its tiny frame. More notifications flashed. Congratulations! Your mutations have merged. Congratulations! Your domain has... They couldn't focus on the text long enough to read, collapsing onto the ground as the last dregs of power left their muscles. Their eyelids drooped as the marching sounds drew nearer. They knew they had to get the hell out of here before it was too late, but they couldn't even stand. The last thing they registered before their eyes fell shut was the sight of countless figures surrounding them. A forest of antennas, carapaces, mandibles, and membranous wings of all shapes and sizes enveloped their bodies, dragging them away. Once again, they found themselves at a strange place. At first, they thought this was another alien world. Perhaps one of their clones had claimed a new body. They soon realized that this couldn't be the case. After all, they didn't remember the journey to this planet, nor the process of stitching their host's soul. Besides, the scenery was all wrong. It was way too fantastical to be anything but a figment of their imagination. And too familiar to be anything but a dream forged out of their memories. In front of them, a vast plain stretched as far as the eye could see, covered in snow. Howling winds sang like before, though the symphony wasn't nearly as loud as it had been during the fight. Turning around, they saw something that didn't fit here at all, a dense, sunlit forest, the canopies of its aged pines swaying rhythmically under a much softer breeze, whistling sounds emanating from their hollow cones. To their right, a large building stood under a red sky. It was downright colossal, some kind of stadium. They'd only seen it once in their lives, at least from the outside, though they'd spent a whole lot more time living inside it. They wished to examine it from up close, and this strange world obliged. Suddenly, they found themselves standing in the center of an arena, blood-soaked sand crunching beneath their feet, with the occasional shard of bone sticking out and failing to stab into their callous soles. The acrid stench of iron filled their nostrils, stinging the back of their throat. A crimson star shone dimly overhead, painting a stark contrast against the dark sky above the snowy plain or the bright sunlight spilling through the branches of the forest they'd just left behind. Rows upon rows of stands rose around the arena, though they failed to spot another soul. Even so, they could almost hear the crowds cheering, jeering, and booing, the buzzing cacophony of their treacherous people having long been seared into their memory. Walking across the sand, they recalled many of the vicious opponents they'd faced in this gods-forsaken place. Six-pawed monstrosities, packs of smaller beasts, and even fellow gladiators, left with no choice but to fight each other to the death to please their cruel captors. Feeling done with this hellish pit for good, they walked toward one of the imposing gates, wishing to pay their old cell a brief visit. Their time there had been no less unpleasant, but they had spent the vast majority of their life sitting on the cold, damp floor, playing their handcrafted kicklet, their bottom right palm barely pressed against the metallic door, causing their surroundings to shift again. At least, the strange dream was kind enough to provide them with shortcuts whenever they wanted to move, sparing them from having to walk. Finding themselves back in their cell as requested, they brushed their fingers along the bars. They distinctly remembered that the material had felt a little smoother when they first got shoved into their lifelong prison, though it had gradually grown quite rough after accumulating rust for decades. Walking to the back of the cell, they stepped into the murky puddle, not particularly bothered by the filthy water splashing beneath their feet. Reaching into the darkness, they picked up a half-rotten chunk of raw meat from their most recent kill, or rather, a creature they'd killed a long time ago, pecking a chunk off for nostalgia's sake. Their time in the Colosseum was arguably among their least favorite memories. Even so, they were glad that they'd finally recalled it all. No matter how bad it had been, this was a part of who they were. Not to mention, it served as a grim reminder of the ghastly fate that would continue to be inflicted upon their people, until they managed to free their conquered world from its oppressors. For a moment, they considered returning to the other places. The dark side of Huehue, the whistling woods, the fungal spire, the grisly bog, the thirsty valley, the vault of magic, Thalmara, Melodia, Golimus, Thescala, Remir's ocean. But there was no point. There was nothing else that they needed to recall. If anything, they remembered way too much now. It was quite bizarre, actually, how well they could picture even the most minute details of their past. Even things normally too small and unimportant for a regular person to retain. Even weirder was how they could remember multiple different pasts, all of them converging into a single present. They could still tell with ease which of their memories had come from Mickey the Crow, Mickey the Gladiator, or Percival Avalon, though the distinction felt almost meaningless right now. None of it was more or less important than the rest. Remir was their home, but so was Huehue. Their wings and talons were as familiar as their four hands, their mouth and nose, or their sovereign's eye. Elaine and Baldy were their family, but so were their parents and sister. If you come across this story on Amazon, be aware that it has been stolen from Royal Road. Please report it. As a matter of fact, they'd recalled a few details that might lead to their missing father. While their mother and sister had been murdered before their very eyes, thus leaving no room for hope, the man's fate had still been unknown, at least according to the previous memories they'd recovered. Thankfully, they now knew that they had tried to inquire about that person several times during their long stay in the Colosseum. They'd begged the wardens to ask around, feeding them the occasional morsel of information as a reward for their victories, another reason to keep living their hopeless life. Unfortunately, what they'd been able to gather was rather limited. Whether their captors had been too lazy to look into the matter properly, or simply happy to watch them squirm, they'd likely never know. Either way, the only thing they'd learned was that the man had indeed been captured alive and taken to a different Colosseum. This wasn't much to go on. For all they knew, their father could have died 1,000 times over after fighting for his life every single day, for the past however many decades. Even if he was alive, they'd never deluded themselves into thinking that they would see each other again. Then Mixcoatl had killed them and the rest was history. Well, at least there's a chance now, they thought before shaking their head. First, they needed to make sense of their current situation. Figuring out what had happened wasn't very difficult. Obviously, their souls had fused while fighting Deimos. There, the crow's soul had flown back to their Percy's body upon their death, bringing about this unusual state. It wasn't ideal, since this was the very thing they tried so hard to prevent from the moment they began equipping the familiar with a clone.
Ni vitaye.
Then again, it wasn't necessarily a bad outcome. It had given them the strength to take that bastard down, and it had even helped them recall the rest of their missing memories. It didn't even feel that bad. In fact, they felt better than ever before, their minds seemingly working in perfect sync to peer through a layer of fog that they'd never even noticed was there. What they were currently experiencing most certainly wasn't the result of an advancement, though in many ways it felt better than one. They were sure that their current condition came with several more advantages and disadvantages that they would slowly discover over the coming days, but that was an issue for later. Let's start by waking up from this dream. In theory, they still had two bodies to return to. They clearly remembered the crow's still figure splitting off from their cloak at the end of the battle. Whether they could access either or even both of the bodies at once remained to be seen. All of that was under the assumption that they were still alive, of course. They hadn't forgotten about the army of wasps carrying them away, the feeling of the encroaching bugs still giving them goosebumps. However, they didn't think that the creatures had hurt them. For one, dead people shouldn't be having dreams. We'll try to occupy the human body first, they decided. It was the one most likely to be functional, since it was their bloodline that had made everything possible in the first place. On top of that, it was also the body they had defaulted to after killing Deimos, as well as the most convenient to keep if they were forced to choose. Wishing themselves out seemed to do the trick. It took a while, but the world around them shook, the cell crumbling to dust before the rest of the Colosseum followed. A mountain of debris landed on their head, though it didn't crush them. It merely trapped them in a dark ocean of sand, unable to breathe or even twitch a muscle. Thankfully, the suffocating feeling only lasted a moment or two. Then they found themselves resting on solid ground again. This time, they were almost certain it was actual ground too. They were back in the real world. Lifting their head, they examined their new surroundings. They were inside a vast cavern, its surfaces covered with colorful minerals, the air thick with glowing motes. Clearly, they were back inside the hive, far deeper than any of their wasp clones had ventured before. Probably near the Starry Queen's chamber too, judging from the size of everything. Besides them, there was only a single other object in the room. No, not an object. A body. It was still alive, its chest heaving up and down as soft breaths escaped its lips, though the creature was clearly asleep. It sported a humanoid shape, though it was far larger than it had any right to be. It was downright colossal. In fact, the sleeping giant appeared to be as tall as a blue beast, despite the fact that it couldn't be anything but a sapient. Finding the discrepancy difficult to accept, they scanned their slumbering roommate closely, gasping upon recognizing his features. Their features. This was actually their own body, Percy's. Only now did they realize that they'd actually woken up in the crow's body by accident. It wasn't their human body that had grown larger. It was just the bird that had shrunk after the fight, for some reason. And it had been a while since the last time they'd seen a regular human from such a vantage point. Not a great sign, they thought, clicking their beak in irritation over their failure. It should still be possible to access the other body though. They just had to perform a few more tests. Regardless, the space they were in clearly wasn't as massive as they'd initially thought, though it was still wide enough for an actual blue beast to crawl through with ease. A violet might fit too, though they'd never actually seen one. Scanning the cavern, they failed to spot any trace of the giant wasps. Perhaps they were giving the creatures too much credit, but it almost felt as if they'd intentionally left them here alone to rest peacefully, until they were ready to reach out. They still had no idea what the magical insects wanted from them, though the Starry Queen had clearly shown great interest in them during their previous escape from the hive. Thankfully, she appeared more courteous towards them than expected, arguably more than they deserved too, considering how many of her offspring they'd slain over the years. In any case, they could deal with the bugs later. Right now, they had to figure out how to control their bodies properly, and to go over the most recent changes in their status. Also, they had to stop referring to themselves as they. At first, they weren't sure how they were meant to navigate between their two bodies, though they guessed that the most obvious solution would involve fiddling with their cord, assuming that they still had one. Searching for the connection in its usual spot on their chest, they soon found something that made them gasp in shock. It feels so much wider than before. Granted, describing their link in physical terms had never been a simple task. It was impossible to put an exact number on its diameter or cross-section, because the cord didn't exist in the physical plane. In fact, it didn't even pass through the much fuzzier soul plane that tended to greatly distort time and space. Instead, it seemed to exist inside a third, even more esoteric dimension, one exclusive to Percy, his clones and his familiar. Whether the clone bloodline had created this private realm or merely allowed them to tap into it, they didn't know. Either way, it was the reason they could communicate and send mana across vast distances, provided that they could keep the connection open from that far away. In theory, they could have tried to gauge the width of their cords indirectly, by estimating the amount of mana that they allowed through, but even that had always been quite challenging. After all, mana could be compressed countless times in its unmanifested state. A red and a demigod both stored their entire reserves inside a tiny orb in their sternum, yet mages at the higher grades could easily expand their mana enough to conjure enormous boulders or fill entire lakes with water. After obtaining the Sorcerer's Eye and upgrading their secret art to refined, they had technically gained the ability to perceive the cords directly, but, again, what their eyes had shown them about the cord's dimensions had never been that trustworthy. As a result, they'd only used the information to better orient themselves, and pinpoint the direction and distance to their clones, not the transmission process itself. Consequently, the best that Percy and Mickey had ever been able to do had been to compare one type of cord to another. The original connection was the one they used most commonly, since it was the least expensive to maintain. Everything beyond that required either an additional clone or a lot of effort. The empowered cords granted by soul resonance allowed them to transmit more mana and from farther away, but activating and maintaining them was a hassle. Then, there was the two-way connection Percy and Mickey had relied on over the past couple of years, after upgrading their secret art to soul harmony. It had doubled the cord's capacity and even allowed them to keep it open passively, by twisting two of the empowered connections together and creating a permanent loop of soul mana between them, though that had come at the cost of permanently occupying a second cord. That said, they currently had access to a connection that appeared to eclipse even that. It was probably best described as a vast tunnel, rather than a cord. More importantly, it felt like they could push more than just mana or information through it. Come to think of it, isn't our soul already stretching inside? That had never happened before. As intimate as Percy and Mickey's connection had been, their souls had always been separate. Right now, that was no longer the case. They had clearly fused completely, their joint existence now spanning both bodies. If that's the case, why is only the crow awake? They wondered. This was especially glaring, considering that they shouldn't have lost the insomnia trait. Playing around some more, they soon realized that they could shift their soul better than most living beings could. This was something that they hadn't been able to do in their original bodies. This was closer to how the clones tended to interact with their hosts. In addition to this increased flexibility, the crow body felt rather cramped, almost like a disproportional fraction of their soul had folded up inside it. Another chunk was resting inside the cord, suspended in the strange dimension, with only the tiniest wisp lingering in their human vessel. It's probably a good thing that there's some of it left, otherwise one of our bodies might have died in its sleep, they realized, swallowing hard. If they had to describe this situation to somebody, they'd use the analogy of a person resting on a king-sized bed by themselves. There was simply too much room, and they'd accidentally rolled too far toward one side without noticing, creating this imbalance. So, what if they tried to return to the middle? Figuring out how to do that wasn't very difficult. Love what you're reading? Discover and support the author on the platform they originally published on. They already had plenty of experience of doing similar things with their clones. Leaning into the connection, they felt their soul practically fall inside a deep well, soon reaching a much larger vessel and expanding freely on the other side. They had to stop themselves before they rolled too far in the other direction. The whole process felt natural, just a function built into their new existence by default. Epsilon. If there was one thing they didn't appreciate, it was how painful it was to move their soul across the cord. This had nothing to do with their transformation itself, but rather the injuries they'd accumulated during the battle. Many spots felt stiff and riddled with cracks, almost frostbitten, if souls could even experience that. The internal friction worsened their wounds, causing them to wince and grit their beak. Evidently, the state that they had entered while fighting Deimos had greatly strained their soul and bodies. It didn't look like they would be able to do that very often, and recovering afterwards wasn't trivial either. Even so, they persisted until more senses fed into their mind. The hard, uneven ground pressing against the human's back, a second set of soft breaths that was oddly in sync with the first one, and 3 new limbs that they could move around. Sitting up with difficulty, they opened their eyes, scanning the room until their gaze landed on the tiny crow standing on the ground next to them. How bizarre! They could see themselves through 2 pairs of eyes. One saw the gray bird, its icy body now small enough to fit on their head, the other seeing a giant human towering over them like a tall tree. The man's clothes were in tatters, his dark, unkempt hair falling messily over his shoulders as he scratched his bushy beard in contemplation. They were both of them. Obviously, Percy and Mickey had shared senses many times before, so this wasn't entirely new. Still, it was quite different from their previous experiences. It felt less like 2 people borrowing each other's eyes, and more like a single individual rubbing his hands together, feeling each limb through the other. In some ways, this wasn't as comfortable as what they had felt during the fight. Their incarnation as the cloaked figure had felt more right, closer to how they were meant to be. Sadly, their current grades appeared to limit how long they could stay fully fused. Either that, or it was simply something that no living being was capable of maintaining forever. The good news was that they knew how to merge into that form again if they wanted to, but it was obviously better to save that as a trump card. At the very least, they had to mend their injuries before they even considered going all out again. Besides, having two bodies came with its own advantages, so they didn't feel like complaining. Regardless, the spell they had registered during the battle clearly hadn't ended. It had merely gone dormant, the symphony of a dead winter still faintly echoing in the deepest recesses of their soul, patiently building up towards its next crescendo. I guess this is who we are now. Can we even be considered a beast or a sapient anymore? They couldn't help but wonder. A case could certainly be made against that. There probably wasn't even a name for the type of entity they had become. Their souls hadn't merely merged. They had also grown in the process, evolving into something new. Something that their physical vessels struggled to contain by themselves. A lot of their soul would inevitably continue to exist inside the ethereal cord. Perhaps that was their true self, and their bodies were little more than a pair of gloves now, the ethereal entity's only means of interacting with the real world. Was it the crow's beast affinity that had turned them into this? Perhaps recovering so many memories, too many memories to fit in a single head, had played a role, as well as the colossal amount of mana they'd absorbed through their boosting arts to facilitate the transformation. They sighed. At the end of the day, it didn't matter. Paying more attention to their bodies, they soon noticed something else. Well, it looks like our cores and mutations are still constrained to their original bodies for the most part. The human's eyes now glowed in a dull gray color, sporting slit pupils like before. In addition to their regular sight, they could perceive the crow's much lower temperature compared to its surroundings in the form of a dark silhouette in a slightly brighter background. A smaller gray silhouette flowed inside it. This amorphous flame clearly pertained to their soul, or at least the part they had left inside the bird. A green and yellow orb shone in the crow's sternum and abdomen respectively, the corresponding mana channels branching out to the rest of its body like before. The yellow ones were a little difficult to spot, however, since the whole structure was now made out of mana of the same grade. Finally, a thick, ink-like substance permeated the bird, indicating the willpower coursing through the mana. The bird's vision was a lot less detailed than the human's. It couldn't register temperature or willpower at all. It could spot the gray silhouette flowing inside Percy through its passive soul vision, but it wasn't as defined. As for the human's cores, Mickey had to manually tap into his mana sense to locate them. I guess we'll have to fix our missing arm the good old way too, they thought, their human lips curling into a frown as their avian eyes lingered on the stump. The crystalline appendages that they had forged during the fight clearly hadn't survived their separation. It wasn't that strange, considering that they'd been fueled by a mutation that the human body no longer had access to. Getting up, they stretched their remaining limbs with both bodies, noticing how easily they could control them simultaneously. At least, their mind appeared to have kept up with the transformation, meaning that it wouldn't take them very long to adjust to their new reality. They hadn't missed the pyramid still slowly crumbling inside the human's head, of course, and there was also the Starry Queen that they had to deal with, but they wanted a few more questions answered before worrying about any of that. Turning to their trusty status, they braced themselves for what was certainly bound to be quite the overhaul. The status opened before their eyes, the page now far longer than ever before, and full of surprises. The Lone Wanderer. Aspects. Percival. Mictlantecuhtli. Mana cores. Mana core 1p, yellow soul. Mana core 2p, yellow pure. Mana core 1m, green beast. Mana core 2m, yellow ice. Domain. A dead winter, empowered. Bloodline. Clone, create a copy of yourself. Effect varies by affinity. Blessing. Blessing of permanence. Enhance the durability of your soul. Mutations. As Sovereign's Eye. draws from the cumulative knowledge listed in the status to enhance one's vision, allowing them to discern details previously unseen. A greater Thescalan physique greatly enhances one's physical strength and the toughness of their body. Greatly enhances one's resistance to high or low temperatures and sharpens their thermal sense. Greatly enhances one's resistance to toxins. A dead winter elemental uses ice mana to regenerate, shapeshift, and sustain one's body. Allows every part of one's body to interact with souls. Spectral traits. Weaving boosts one's proclivity in manipulating one-dimensional structures. Insomnia eliminates the need for sleep. Ascribing boosts one's proclivity in expressing meaning onto any written medium. Spells. Wild art. Alchemist's intuition crude. Spectral art. Parasitic connection refined. Spectral art. Cauldron of 1,000 whispers masterful. A spectral art. Instantaneous formation masterful. A hybrid art. Core bestowal masterful. A ultimate art. Symphony of a dead winter extreme. Alchemic principles. O extraction. Separate and condense an ingredient's essence. A pacification. Delay an ingredient's activation rate. Redirection. Adjust an ingredient's effect. A deattunement. Prevent multiple conflicting ingredients from reacting with one another. Bonding. Enrich an ingredient with crystallized pure mana. Restructuring. Alter an ingredient's phase. A scaling. Brew a greater volume of ingredients at once. A compression. Elevate an ingredient to the next grade. Decrees. Phoebe's decree grants access to your status. Iapetus' decree grants a bloodline. Morai's decree grants a second mana core. Metatron's decree open a one-way portal to the vault of magic at will. Ie's decree modified augments and enhances your status. Grants the sovereign's eye. Obatala's decree modified augments and enhances your status. Allows you to effortlessly deploy your domain in its strongest state. Undersir. The human body creased its brow as soon as its gaze landed on the first line. The lone wanderer? Is that what we're called now? Perhaps it wasn't so strange that their status no longer deemed it fit to refer to them as Percival Avalon or Mictlantecuhtli, as neither of those names was very accurate anymore. Even so, it felt a bit intrusive of Phoebe's decree to pick a new name for them. Then again, they had to admit that this moniker was rather fitting. They'd always been a wanderer, after all. That was their defining feature, and the main source of their abilities. As for the other part, that they felt more inclined to protest, as being called out as a loner wasn't the most pleasant thing. Still, it wasn't that inaccurate either, considering how their souls had fused into one, or how averse Percy had generally been to socializing. They really might end up as a lone wanderer, if they kept hanging out with nobody but their familiars, and those all eventually fused with them. Which brought another issue to question. How will the status even handle Nephthys? And do we still want to turn her into a familiar at this point? They couldn't help but wonder. They imagined that placing her in a wasp egg wouldn't turn her into one of those new aspects directly, just a regular familiar. After all, Percy and Mickey had gone through so many hoops to end up in this situation. It might not even be possible for another familiar to merge so deeply with them without the right combination of affinities or mutations. But there were still several things they didn't know. Would their status create a new list of familiars to place the former goddess in? Or would it just treat her the same way it had treated the crow in the past, giving her an extension of their own status that she couldn't even access by herself? Either way, they weren't sure they wanted to risk inviting another person to occupy such a permanent spot in their soul. That was not to say that they regretted what had happened to them, but there was a huge difference between Percy and Mickey, who had considered each other more than brothers for decades. Merging like this, and them doing so with a complete stranger. Turning Nephthys into a regular familiar was already a huge deal, let alone something even more intimate and downright irreversible. Well, we did promise to help her and her people. It would be shitty of us to let them die out of selfishness. Besides, We'll probably have plenty of time to vet her properly and ask her opinion before doing anything crazier. Pushing the questions about aspects and familiars to the back of their mind for now, they moved on to the mana cores. All 4 of the organs were grouped up, though their status had weirdly chosen to stick their initials next to the numbers, listing them as 1P, 2P, 1M and 2M instead of just numbering them 1 to 4. This was clearly intentional and actually made a lot of sense if they thought about it. The situation with their new cores was different from the ones granted by the Morais decree. While they could wield all 4 of them at once, each only provided its passive benefits to the corresponding body. At the very least, they hadn't noticed any increase in their physical strength or lifespans. The last part was especially disappointing, in fact. They didn't look forward to watching one of their bodies die of old age before the other. Then again, the plan had always been for both of them to attain divinity anyway, so they would have done their best to prevent that from happening regardless. Even if they failed and one of their bodies died in the end, both of their souls would hopefully survive in the other, so it wasn't all gloom and doom. Next, there were the changes to their domain. There was a lot to consider, and it was clear that their domain had played a decisive role in their victory against Deimos. They'd already had a somewhat clear idea of how Obatala's approval tended to affect various bodies across different grades, and they had a few guesses as to what exactly had happened to them during the fight. Even so, studying their domain wasn't a priority right now. They'd rather focus on understanding their bodies first, before moving on to other pressing things. That inevitably brought them to the next 3 sections: their bloodline, their mutations, and their spectral traits, which should probably be considered together. As they had previously surmised, the first 2 only appeared to affect their original bodies, though the status had listed them together, not bothering to mark them like the cores. The human body was the only one that could stir the bloodline, though both souls would inevitably be part of their future clones, since there was no separating them at this point. Does that mean that our capacity has increased? They wondered. 2 souls should mean more chords, right? Especially since Mickey had been at Green, bringing a stronger soul into the mix. If it worked as they hoped, they might even be able to use the extra chords to create more familiars and aspects, thus gaining even more chords in the process. Their hearts couldn't help but skip a couple of beats, as they realized how easily that could be abused into giving them an infinite army of aspects, familiars and clones. Searching inward, they tried to feel how many connections they still had available. In the past, they hadn't been able to tell. Percy had needed to blindly create clones until he passed that limit, growing dizzy and losing control of his body. However, he'd slowly developed a sense for his capacity over the past couple of years, an inevitable consequence of juggling so many connections daily. Their expressions sagged as soon as it became clear that they could only create 4 more clones, the same as right before their fusion. Evidently, not only had Mickey's soul not added to their capacity, they hadn't even recovered the cord used up by the clone in the bird's body. It isn't very surprising, though. It was probably consumed to facilitate our evolution, they reasoned. It would certainly explain how their cord had been able to widen so much, how their soul had grown to this extent, and how their mental capacity had kept up with the other changes. So much for infinite clones. They sighed, lamenting the lost opportunity. Clearly, only the part of their soul originating from Percy had contributed to their capacity, so they'd have to wait over a century for more cords. They didn't know why exactly that was, but the most logical explanation was that it had something to do with the way the soul affinity interacted with the bloodline in the human body. Maybe that was for the best, though. Had it been otherwise, they would have failed to resist the temptation of merging with 1,000 others, slowly losing themselves in the process. What about the spectral traits, then? Can we absorb another fiend now? The fiends had nothing to do with the clone bloodline, so there was a chance that both souls would affect their capacity. At the very least, they could tell that their traits worked with both bodies, unlike the bloodline that could only be activated by one of them. The fact that the crow's plumage had turned gray was further proof that the blessing of permanence now stretched to their entire soul, not just the part inside the human body, the soul predator mutation being the likely culprit for manifesting that color onto the feathers. Let's wait until we get the ring back before trying anything stupid, they decided. They had no clue how to test their capacity for traits by themselves, and it was too risky to attempt absorbing a fiend before being sure. Of course, Zoras probably wouldn't be able to answer that question either, but he might be able to help them check. Focusing on their mutations again, they noted that 2 of them had remained unchanged. Or rather, the entries had, though the color of their sovereigns I had shifted again during the transformation. The change appeared to be purely cosmetic, but it was one they welcomed, as the gray hue resembled Percy's original eyes more closely. It would put other humans at ease and allow them to stand out less in a crowd. As for their greater Thescalan physique, it hadn't changed in any way, but that didn't mean that it hadn't played a decisive role in the previous battle. In fact, it was probably one of the main reasons they'd even managed to survive the transformation. If it hadn't been for the increased toughness of their body and their elevated resistance to cold temperatures, they might have really died from their own spell, just like that bastard Deimos had told them. Finally, there was the elephant-sized beast in the cavern, the new mutation. Dead winter elemental, huh? This one was obviously the only mutation affecting the crow's body. Be it through its description or just simple deduction, it was clear that it represented the fusion of the bird's previous 4 mutations. It had inherited all their individual benefits and likely strengthened each of them further. Not only did it allow the crow to regenerate from almost any injury and sustain its beast core like before, it was apparently capable of a bunch of additional things now. What does it mean by shapeshift? We'll need a lot of mana to test the new mutation's effects, they realized. Taking a few deep breaths, they gathered the colorful motes in the cavern closer, the particles taking on a gray hue as they transformed into dancing flames, long ribbons and a violent snowstorm. The elements seeped in and out of their pores, filling their channels with mana and their muscles with strength. Soon, it became clear that they could still access the original forms of their boosting arts, the carnival and the symbol of the savage gods, even without going all out. In fact, it appeared that they had a lot more flexibility right now than before their fusion. The human and the crow had each cleared and tempered sets of pure, soul, ice, water, and air channels. The first could only contain variants of pure mana, so the best resource to fill them up with was naturally phantom mana. The last 3 networks could contain soul-freezing ice, while the soul channels could handle either of the fused affinities. In the past, Percy and Mickey had only been able to convert ambient mana to the types they had the correct cores for, but it now seemed like they could create whatever resources they needed on either end of their existence, without having to constantly pass their mana back and forth. Well, it's not perfect. Sadly, the crow body was the only one with beast channels, as the affinity couldn't exist anywhere outside its circulatory system. On top of that, the human body still had a lower resistance to cold than the bird, though it had certainly climbed by another step after the fusion. Finally, the exact ratio of mana that each body could wield was further capped by the cores they possessed, allowing the human to circulate more phantom mana and the crow to fill up on soul-freezing ice. Still, they would certainly have a lot more options during a fight. Satisfied with their findings, they moved on to other tasks. The human body poured phantom mana into the self-repair enchantments on his robes. The ice mana had distorted the construct greatly earlier, leaving Percy almost naked. The tattered rags drank the gray flames greedily, soon expanding to cover the rest of the body. The once chaotic weave grew orderly again, the clothes turning tidier as the faded enchantments suddenly became readable. At the same time, they used some of the mana to mend their injured soul. The frostbitten patches refused to thaw at first, making them realize that the backlash of their new spell wasn't so easy to reverse. They should be able to carve out the smaller wounds entirely, regrowing those parts of their soul from scratch. However, they'd have to slowly thaw and heal the larger of the stiff regions properly, which would inevitably take a few days. Better get on it then. The sooner we're no longer a complete mess, the sooner we'll be able to place Nephthys inside an egg. While the human body was busy pouring phantom mana into their cloak and soul, the crow took control of the soul-freezing ice, trying to activate the new mutation. Luckily, it didn't seem to require much effort, the crystalline flesh responding almost immediately to their wishes. The tiny bird absorbed the gray blizzard like a sponge, growing rapidly. Within seconds, it was as tall as a human, its talons turning into feet, its wings into hands, and its beak into an exact replica of Percy's face. The two bodies looked at each other, feeling like they were staring inside a three-dimensional mirror, albeit one that had replaced tan skin with ice, dark hair with glossy strands, and even regrown their missing limb. Lifting its artificial hands, the not really a crow body clenched and unclenched its fists, realizing they felt no different from a human's. But they didn't stop there. Drawing even more mana, they transformed again. They grew a few centimeters taller, a new beak forming on their head as their torso turned slightly bulkier, a second pair of arms sprouting right beneath the first. This was the original Mickey's appearance. A case of content theft. This narrative is not rightfully on Amazon. If you spot it, report the violation. Punching empty space a few times, they listened to the booming shockwaves their fists released, taking a moment to appreciate the feeling of the air splitting against their skin, leaving no question as to the sheer power their icy muscles now packed. Okay, we look like the original Mickey, but this is definitely a much stronger body. While Mickey had spent a lot of time fighting in the Colosseum, he had still ultimately been a yellow sapient, while the new body was technically a beast with a green and a yellow core, even if it didn't currently look the part. Absorbing more mana, they shape-shifted one final time, ditching their hands for wings again, turning back into a crow. Only, this time they were as large as an elephant, much like Mickey had been right before their fusion. They did try to grow further still, but that destabilized their body, the ice falling apart to reveal a regular-sized crow. That's probably the largest body those two cores can support by themselves. We'll likely need both bodies working together to form a construct as big as the one we used against Deimos, they realized. Over the next few minutes, they performed some additional tests, playing around with their different forms while exploring their limits. Switching between them was relatively quick and painless, though they struggled to transform into anything outside the four shapes they were familiar with. It should be possible, but it would probably take a lot of practice before they got used to anything else. A project for the future, but not a priority, since the choices they had available already covered most of their needs. The small crow was the least conspicuous form, as well as the one that would consume the least stamina. Of course, all four shapes could be maintained indefinitely, but the most efficient one would allow a greater ratio of their meals to be directed into the beast core's advancement, probably shrinking the time to blue greatly. At the very least, they fully expected the ice body to spend most of its time in that shape moving forward. The giant bird was the fastest and strongest, physically at least. However, the sapient forms could borrow and wield the same tools as the human body, using the cloak and harvesters to reproduce most of the carnival's parades. In many ways, they should be even stronger than the human, though the reduced phantom mana would limit the maximum number of constructs they could wield, and the lack of the sovereign's eye would prevent them from predicting their opponent's moves. More importantly, those two forms should be capable of performing the finer arts like alchemy or runecrafting, and even interacting with others like regular people. Unfortunately, their icy texture would make them stand out, so blending in a crowd wouldn't be easy, but the crow body's endless flexibility was bound to serve them greatly down the line. Well, it's probably more accurate to call it the elemental body now. Shaking the pointless thoughts out of their heads, they then moved to the other sections. The alchemic principles had remained entirely untouched, and so had the decrees. Funnily enough, the Morais decree now affected them twice, even though its entry mentioned nothing of the sort. Most people in the universe would likely lose their minds if they knew that somebody had found a way to not only steal, but completely abuse one of the most powerful decrees in existence. There was no longer any question as to whether Phoebe's or Obatala's decrees affected the human or the elemental, since they only had a single status shared between them. Iapetus' decree only worked on Percy, however, as did the mutation part of EA's gift. The biggest question mark in the entire section was Metatron's decree. They imagined that both bodies should have access to it, because Mickey had been able to use it before, with the clone's help, but that wasn't what bothered them. What the hell happened back there? Why didn't it activate when we needed it to? Strictly speaking, it was probably a good thing that they'd failed to escape to the vault. While their current situation had its downsides, there was plenty to be happy about. Falling into the Titan's hands would have certainly been a lot worse. However, that was irrelevant. The problem was that whoever had prevented them from opening the portal couldn't have possibly predicted their fusion. They'd clearly been willing to let at least Mickey, and probably Percy too, to die. As for who it was, well, it had to have been one of Remir's gods. Probably Phoebe herself, as they couldn't imagine anyone else interfering with a decree like that. They'd long suspected that the Titaness had set her eyes on them, of course, though they still had no idea what she wanted. They had obviously brought lots of valuable techniques and treasures to Remir, so it wasn't that strange that the Order had decided not to directly join the Roots' manhunt. But that didn't explain why they had even allowed their subordinates to continue chasing them, or why Phoebe had suddenly been willing to let them die. Well, we can't really blame her for not wanting us to open a portal to the vault. Still, she could have intervened in a way that didn't completely screw us over. Alas, the gods' whims were sadly not something they could do anything about right now. Shrugging, they decided to move on to the thing they'd deliberately left for last. Opening their status, they read the spell section once more, their eyes landing on what was arguably the most important of the new entries, as well as the cause of everything else that had happened to them. The new spells, Wild Art, Alchemist's Intuition Crude, Spectral Art, Parasitic Connection Refined, Spectral Art, Cauldron of 1,000 Whispers, Masterful, a Spectral Art, Instantaneous Formation Masterful, a Hybrid Art, Core Bestowal Masterful, a Ultimate Art, Symphony of a Dead Winter Extreme. Ultimate Art, well, that sure answers what happens when a spell requires both a bloodline, a mutation, and a spectral trait to work. They thought, the human body scratching the back of its head. The name is a bit tacky, though. Regardless, they finally knew what the tier above Masterful was called, yet that only created more questions. Had this so-called extreme tier always existed, or was it something their status had come up with on the spot? Normally, masterful spells were meant for violets and whites, so who were extreme spells even meant for? Just demigods? Or perhaps none but the most talented mortals? If not them, surely a god would be capable of casting something similar, right? Either way, one thing was for certain. If it hadn't been for the pretty unique circumstances of the previous battle, they would have probably never merged their spells like this. Not even after training for 1,000 years. And they weren't just being modest or pessimistic either. While Percy and Mickey had done a great job developing so many masterful spells with such low grades and at such a young age, it was painfully apparent that their new technique was on a whole other level from any of its components. It was the result of 5 masterful spells fusing, 4 of Percy's and 1 of Mickey's, each of which had been an extremely intricate piece of magic in and of itself. Many of them had involved several moving parts of their own, with 3 having been close to the very top of the tier in the first place. It wasn't that strange that their fusion warranted a new classification, but getting all the components to fit together seamlessly would have been an impossible challenge for a regular person. They'd only succeeded because they'd somehow managed to get 3 minds to collaborate perfectly on the task. In fact, they wouldn't be surprised if they'd consumed a lot of Wiseman's murmurs in the process too. Too much was going on for us to notice, but come to think of it, hasn't the influx of ideas grown a bit quieter now? We haven't bled the pyramid dry, have we? The plan had always been to leave some of the resource for the Wasp Familiar, to give Nephthys a helping hand as she began her new life. It was the least the goddess deserved, considering that the murmurs had come from her in the first place. Hopefully, it was just their imagination, and the only reason the substance wasn't making its presence known at the moment was because they weren't practicing their magic. Not that they were planning to do that anytime soon, though. They'd already fused half of their spells into the Symphony of a Dead Winter, closer to 100% of their arsenal, actually, if they excluded all the auxiliary spells that had little to do with combat. Consequently, they had no idea how to continue raising their strength. We could aim for some incremental improvements, but we'll probably experience diminishing returns moving forward, they realized. They should be able to hone their Magiscript further the next time they visited the vault, and they might also be able to come up with a more efficient form of affinity fusion that involved ice, soul, and pure mana. They could also try using green Troll's Fury tattoos, or even working other variants of potions into their kit. Finally, learning to wield their domain better might help, among other things. However, all of those projects were relatively minor, at least compared to everything they'd already incorporated into the spell. It would take several time-consuming improvements for too little gain. Not that killing a powerful violet with only a bunch of yellow and green cores was anything to scoff at, but the lone wanderer suddenly found himself with fewer promising projects to work on than usual. This was perhaps the perfect time to shift their attention to more peaceful ventures. Growing any stronger in their current grades was a tall order, so their best bet would be to sprint toward their next promotions, be they natural or artificial. Of course, their clones were bound to find more interesting things to bring back at some point, opening new doors for them, but that wasn't something they could plan for. This book's true home is on another platform. Check it out there for the real experience. We should try to settle down anyway. Right now, the priority is giving Nephthys a body, followed by figuring out the situation in the guild and the rest of Remir. Weirdly enough, they had already grown stronger than most of the violets leading the noble houses. If they excluded the Greenborns in the Divine Order, there might be fewer than 100 mortals in the world capable of beating them in single combat. Well, single, if they don't call us out for cheating. With Deimos out of the picture and their enemies having learned some tough lessons recently, they might not encounter too much resistance if they tried to free Baldi and Orin. Then, they could look for some remote corner to hide in for the next few centuries, focusing on the new familiar's growth, alchemy, Magiscript, cleansing their cores, and exploring the universe. Sounds like a plan. All this fighting has gotten pretty cumbersome anyway. Heaving out a tired breath, they closed their status, having finished going over everything. Their transformation had changed a lot, but they felt that they now had a decent grasp on their new reality. Over the next couple of hours, they poured their efforts into mending as much of the soul damage as possible. They weren't going to recover completely in such a short time, but they wanted to at least be able to carve out a chunk of their soul without fainting, to fashion the familiar out of, assuming that they managed to get an egg from the Starry Queen. On top of that, they hoped that they would be able to activate their new spell in a pinch. They still had no idea what the ruler of the magical hive wanted from them, but there was always a chance that things would devolve to violence. Activating the symphony before they fully recovered wouldn't be pleasant, but they would need its power to break out of the underground prison if the worst came to pass. As they worked on thawing out their soul, they took some time to consider a different issue. How are we going to interact with other people moving forward? Ideally, they should make an effort to think of themselves as Percy and Mickey whenever possible, and to try and behave as two separate individuals, if not inside their heads, then at least when interacting with others. Keeping the facade up wouldn't be easy, as they clearly defaulted to referring to themselves as they. Pretending to talk to one another would be the equivalent of a regular person developing a split personality on purpose, making the whole thing as silly as it was impractical. Still, as annoying as it sounded, they knew they had to do something to put their friends and family at ease. Conforming to basic social norms and expectations would likely serve them better in the long run. And who knew? Maybe they'd find a way to separate their minds and stuff them back into their respective bodies one day, if only whenever it was more convenient than being fused. It's settled then. I'll be Percy again and you'll be Mickey, the human body said, getting a nod back. It already felt weird, if not downright cringeworthy, but they'd have to get used to it. As soon as they were ready, they finally stepped out of the cavern and into the only tunnel leading to the next one. The elemental body, no. Mickey, had shifted back to Percy's form, ready to fight if necessary. This was the best form to use right now for several reasons. For one, he wouldn't be able to fly in such a cramped space, so neither the large nor the small birds would be any useful here. The forearm shape might be a little stronger than the human one, but there was another problem with it. Walking ahead, Percy tore a strip from his cloak, tossing it to his companion. The latter poured some phantom mana to regenerate it, soon donning an identical copy. Unfortunately, his other form was too burly for it and had a couple of arms too many. If necessary, he could wear a slightly distorted version, but it was better to use one that fit him properly for now and worry about weaving a new set of clothes later. As they passed through the wide tunnel, they couldn't help but gawk over the colorful minerals lining the walls and ceiling. Among them, they even spotted a material they recognized, a dark vein with hundreds of tiny dots glittering over its glossy surface. Obsidian marble. It could be used to craft long-lasting spatial amulets, though they didn't really need any more of those at the moment. Even so, they were tempted to snatch a few crystals and ores of each type to experiment on later. In the past, Percy might have thought twice about disturbing the environment inside the precious hive, if not out of fear of breaking the law, then out of respect for its importance in Remir's survival. That ship had largely sailed, of course, considering how much he'd disturbed this place already. Besides, grabbing a few rocks wouldn't really make a difference. Not right now, he thought, shaking his head. Robbing the place when they were about to meet its ruler might not be a great idea. Approaching the end of the corridor, they felt the ground rumble beneath their feet, a constant buzzing sound growing louder by the second. Swallowing hard, they pressed on, knowing that there was no avoiding what was to come. Reaching the exit, they found themselves inside a room several times larger than the last one. The deposits scattered across the stone surfaces shone even more brightly than those in the tunnel. Countless exits led out of the cavern, each wide enough for at least a blue bug to easily crawl through, with many being even bigger than that. The air was thick with dancing motes, though the particles were constantly disturbed by the thousands of insects of all shapes and sizes crawling out of one tunnel and into another. The red-cored starry drones were as big as a man's fist, while the orange-cored starry workers and the yellow-cored starry soldiers were as large as foxes or humans, respectively. There were plenty of green-cored starry knights too, each the size of an elephant, reminding Percy and Mickey of the monstrosity that had nearly claimed their life the last time they'd found themselves inside the hive. They didn't see any of the blue beasts around, however. There probably weren't that many of them in the colony to begin with, or they simply didn't have a reason to regularly wander through its tunnels. Either way, Percy and Mickey weren't paying the scenery or the smaller creatures any attention. How could they, when they struggled to peel their eyes from the behemoth standing smack in the middle of the room, staring right back at them? One thing was for certain. After today, Percy would never look at a bug the same way again. The creature standing before him towered over the largest buildings he'd seen on Remir, save perhaps for Phoebe's temple at the foot of the Oracle Mountain, or the headquarters of the noble houses. The gargantuan insect was nearly 30 meters tall, and over twice as long from antennae to stinger. Her membranous wings were folded neatly behind her back, though Percy wouldn't be surprised if they could stretch even wider than her body. Overall, her appearance was rather similar to that of the smaller bugs. A black, glossy carapace sprinkled with colorful dots that resembled stars, the very reason for the name of their species. However, there were a few differences that set the queen apart from her offspring, outside of her size. A golden watermark pattern covered her entire exoskeleton, rippling through and around the stars, making the creature's chitinous exterior resemble a galactic nebula. Percy guessed that the queen owed her strange markings to either her royal lineage or her violet grade. Or perhaps the two things were one and the same, but he knew even less about the hive's inner workings to tell with certainty. Another feature which the smaller bugs might actually share with their mother, but which Percy hadn't noticed in the past, was a series of jagged ends lining the sides of the wasp's limbs. Each was sharp enough to slice a person in half for the crime of merely walking into it by accident. Not that the queen needed the dagger-like protrusions to kill someone. Her limbs were already wide enough to flatten a grown human with a single stomp. Of course, Percy's eyes captured a few more details than his companions. He could clearly follow the bright violet lines spreading through the queen's circulatory system, her soul burning beneath her flesh like a silver inferno as an ocean of ink-colored willpower rolled and tussled violently within her frame, barely contained. I have to give her credit for suppressing her domain, at least. She's more polite than most humans I've met, he noted. Curiously, Percy didn't feel very tense under the creature's scrutinizing gaze. Perhaps he should have been more wary of the monster, considering how much larger and stronger it was than the Starry Night that had nearly claimed his life a few years prior. Then again, his confidence wasn't unfounded either, given how much stronger he and Mickey had grown since their frantic escape from the guild. Even so, the elemental body stepped closer to the human, ready to meld into his cloak at a moment's notice. If the colossal insect was weaker than Deimos, they might be able to take it down without going all out, but fighting their way out of the hive was bound to be even harder. "Greetings, Your Majesty," Percy said, bowing his head slightly. He had no idea whether the creature could even understand him, let alone appreciate the gesture, but he genuinely felt like reciprocating the Queen's excellent manners. "I must thank you for your hospitality, and for giving us the time and space to recover before our meeting." No response. The wasp didn't so much as twitch. She was still looking at them unflinchingly. Their figures reflected countless times across her compound eyes. The other bugs stopped moving at once, however, halting their incessant buzzing and plunging the chamber into silence so deep that one could hear a pin drop. Yet, one of the creatures did move, a shape slowly approaching by the corner of Mickey's vision. It was an elephant-sized bug, a starry night, its rhythmic steps echoing through the vast chamber. Walking in front of Percy, it stopped right between him and its mother. Percy had no idea what the insects were up to, so he just watched with curiosity as the Queen raised her forelimb a few meters above the crystalline floor of the cavern. Without the slightest warning or hesitation, she slammed the colossal limb down at her subject, sending a tremor through the hive as she crushed the entire lower half of the bug's body into goo. The gruesome sight caused Percy's eyes to widen with shock. On one hand, the Queen's blatant disregard for the life of her own descendant wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It likely meant that she didn't care as much about all the other insects he and Mickey had slain in the past. On the other hand, it was a clear indication that she wouldn't give a damn about a human's life either. The only reason they were still alive was because she wanted something from them, so they had to make sure the negotiations reached an amicable conclusion if they wanted to leave this place peacefully. A case of literary theft. This tale is not rightfully on Amazon. If you see it, report the violation. What did she do that for, though? Percy wondered, a frown forming on his face as the Starry Queen made no further move. It wasn't until a few seconds later, when she slowly pushed the still-twitching body of the dying Starry Night toward him, that he realized what she wanted. "Don't tell me. Does she expect me to put a clone in this thing?" As cruel of a move as it was, he had to admit that it was chillingly practical. Violet beasts were certainly intelligent enough to communicate with sapients, but it didn't look like the Queen possessed any serviceable vocal cords, nor did the mental field that she used to convey her commands to her subjects seem to extend to anyone else. In other words, the simplest way to speak to Percy would be to have him enter one of the insects' bodies, tapping into their network. And, judging by how thoroughly she'd injured the creature, she'd clearly figured out the basics of how Percy's bloodline worked too. Swallowing hard, mostly due to the Queen's callousness than genuine fear, Percy ignored her offer entirely, walking around the night. Not only did he have no intention of sharing the wasp's agony just to chat with its abusive mother, he also had a much better way available. Approaching the violet beast, he cautiously lifted his arm, placing his palm against the pillar-like forelimb gently, so as to not startle its owner. The chitinous exoskeleton was still covered in green mucus, which was rather unsettling. Percy had to put genuine effort to avoid gagging, unwilling to offend the Queen so soon. Pushing his soul to the very surface of his skin, he used a sliver of gray mana to attach it to the Queen's. Percy had already upgraded his soul-to-soul spell to refined, but he could obviously still access the original, less intrusive version of his spectral art. The giant wasp shuddered for the briefest of instants as their souls connected, though she didn't pull back. "You don't have to sacrifice your subjects just to talk to me," Percy said, as Mickey tossed the spasming remains another glance. "A small loss," a feminine voice responded, cold as ice. "I agree that your method is more convenient, though," she added. "May I know why you've gone to so much trouble to bring us here alive?" Percy asked, cutting to the chase. A faint chuckle echoed in his soul before the creature responded. "Bold of you to ask me that, after breaking into my home without permission, slaughtering thousands of my subjects, and then even having the gall to return. Maybe I just wanted to gut you too personally and take my time savoring your innards." Percy shrugged, not intimidated by the creature's empty threats in the slightest. The Queen had to know how risky it would be to attack him. Besides, he doubted that she'd gone through such lengths just to threaten them. Still, he opted to reply a little more diplomatically than that, to hopefully ease the tension in the room. I do apologize for our transgressions. It was never our intention to stir such a mess last time. We merely wanted to pass through the tunnels to escape from the guild. We would have left peacefully had your children allowed us. The queen clicked her mandibles in annoyance, though it sounded more like a couple of boulders grinding against one another. And what about today's mess? Or did you forget about that chasm you've carved into my hive? My children are still trying to fill up the hole as we speak. But that strange ice of yours isn't making their job easy. Percy flashed the violet beast a sheepish grin, scratching his head as he recalled doing something of the sort during his battle with Deimos. Too much had been going on in his mind at the time to worry about that. Well, I'm sorry about the hole too. As you can imagine, killing violets is messy work, he replied pointedly, his meaning clear. That said, he didn't want to provoke the bug too much, so he rushed to change the topic. Anyway, I'm sure you didn't bring us here just to chastise us. I suppose it's safe to assume you want something? Percy doubted that wasps could exhale, but he was also rather certain that what he felt surging through the queen's soul was as close to a sigh as it could get. It's not merely a question of what I want. It's just as much about what you want, or what you should want at any rate. I'm not sure I follow, Percy replied. It was admittedly just speculation on his part, but he'd been operating under the assumption that she wanted him to teach her circulation. Of all the things he'd revealed during his previous visit, he thought that it was the one most likely to have piqued her interest. That was especially the case if the queen had realized that the boosting art could be used in reverse to preserve or even restore a beast's stamina. Of course, she hadn't seen Mickey use hibernation or regulation, since the crow hadn't even invented those spells yet. On top of that, she would probably find it difficult to replenish her beast mana without a second affinity to draw from. Even so, Percy wouldn't be surprised if the centuries-old creature had recognized the spell's potential at a glance, beast or not. During today's meeting, Percy's hope was to exchange circulation, and maybe even the Morais decree, if necessary, for an egg to place Nephthys in. Or at least, that had been his goal before listening to the queen. Suffice to say, her following words shook both his hopes and assumptions to the core. Then I'll make it clear for you. Unless you find a way to help me, not only is my hive doomed to die out, but with it, so is your entire world. Percy had no idea what the queen meant by those words, though he didn't rush her for an explanation. Luckily, the colossal bug didn't keep him waiting for too long. One of your people broke the ancient pact between my kind and yours, placing both sides at great risk. Pact? The queen nodded mentally. Well, it's more of an unspoken deal than an explicit contract, but your ancestors understood a long time ago that they need our help to produce new gods. Meanwhile, my predecessors also realized that we need your gods to defend our world from outsiders, since producing our own deities ranges from impractical to downright impossible. Percy couldn't help but raise an eyebrow at the revelation. All of this made sense, of course, but he hadn't known that humans and wasps had been operating under a mutual agreement all this time. Then again, it would have been stranger if the two sides had failed to reach some kind of consensus after coexisting for so long. If that's the case, why do my people hunt down your children? Couldn't you just offer us the nectar we need for our advancement, skipping the unnecessary bloodshed entirely? He asked. There are many reasons for this arrangement. Rest assured that I'll explain everything about my hive's inner workings in excruciating detail. There's simply no way around that, not if you are to do what I need you to do. However, you should first understand what the problem is before we discuss anything else. Nodding, Percy gestured for her to continue. Long story short, we were supposed to limit our expansion to within the fungal spire's range. It's not like we ever wanted to move elsewhere anyway, since this is the only place on Remir with enough mana to support our needs. In exchange, your people were supposed to never step foot in our tunnels, and to only collect the nectar they need by hunting the tiny fraction of our kind we send outside. For as long as we can remember, both sides have honored this arrangement religiously. Until we didn't, Percy said, completing her sentence for her. Indeed, a powerful mage broke into my chambers some time ago, stealing something that we cannot survive without. And I doubt I need to explain the consequences of our impending extinction. Percy frowned. He'd come here seeking a body for Nephthys. The last thing he'd expected to hear was that Remir's survival was at stake. Just who would have done something so despicable? Well, okay. That part wasn't so difficult to guess. There simply weren't that many people capable of doing this in the first place. After all, they'd have to break into a hive teeming with green and blue wasps, stealing something of immeasurable importance from their violet ruler. Besides, Percy already harbored some guesses as to the culprit's identity, due to the things he'd learned while helping Nesha snoop around Twilight City, trying to figure out the reason for her family's destruction. Was it a man with a white core by any chance? When exactly did this happen? He was... The creature confirmed. I'm not familiar with how your kind keeps track of time, but to me it still feels rather recent. She added. Let's see. It happened enough time ago for 2 red wasps to have evolved all the way to green, one after the other. Falling silent, Percy took a few seconds to run some calculations in his head. Mickey had spent a couple of decades to reach green, which would translate the wasp's example to roughly 40 years. However, the bugs probably advanced faster than the crow had been able to, considering that they spent most of their lives in such a mana-rich environment, stuffing their faces with nectar every single day. How much faster, Percy didn't know, but if they were about twice as fast as the bird, the timeline would match the reports of McCann's brief tenure in the Alchemist's Guild. I think I may know who it was, but what exactly did he take? Percy asked again, struggling to imagine what could be so valuable to the Queen. An egg, she replied, causing him to swallow hard. Wasn't that exactly what Percy himself had also come here looking for? Though he doubted that the violet beast was talking about the egg of a regular wasp. They likely had millions of those, so it wouldn't make sense that losing one would be such a big deal. Sure enough, the Queen confirmed his assumption. This was my heir's egg. Each starry queen can only ever lay a single egg that carries the royal lineage. Without my daughter to succeed me, our hive will die out as soon as I do, and I cannot give birth to another princess. Only my daughter can. Percy frowned, finding this whole thing completely impractical, if not downright ridiculous. How could the wasp's biology have evolved in such an inconvenient way that the future of their entire species would hinge on the survival of a single member? Then again, it made sense if he thought about it. Magical beasts didn't have to worry about diseases or miscarriages, or whatever the word was for inert wasp eggs. For creatures like these, every single egg was all but guaranteed to hatch into a healthy specimen. Since the bugs had no predators or external threats either, the descendants of the Starry Queen were normally as safe as one could be, hidden in the deepest part of the hive and guarded by countless powerful beasts. Leaving aside the extremely unlikely scenario of a rogue wight foolishly ruining everything, which was admittedly a blind spot in the creature's evolution, the only thing the hive had to worry about was infighting. Had the queens been capable of producing multiple successors, the princesses might tear each other, as well as their entire hive, apart. Viewed from that angle, their inability to give birth to a second heir might serve an integral purpose. The tail has been stolen. If detected on Amazon, report the violation. Fine. That answers what the problem is, but it doesn't explain why that bastard would do something so vile, Percy said. The Queen shook her head, however. Actually, his motive is the one thing we don't have to wonder about. Wasps with the royal lineage produce a denser, purer variant of the nectar that you've no doubt collected from my other descendants. It's called the royal jelly, and it's twice as effective for cleansing one's core. Both of Percy's hearts skipped a beat upon hearing that, a trace of greed worming its way to his eyes. How can this be? He asked, finding the notion difficult to accept. A resource twice as effective as the nectar would translate to having the time to each advancement. Provided that it could be brewed into an elixir, of course. If that was the case, didn't that mean that Remir had technically possessed a path to godhood for Yellowborns all along? Shouldn't their world have already been a greater spring? I know what you're thinking, but it's not as simple as it sounds, the Queen said, dousing his excitement. Royal jelly is twice as effective as regular nectar, but extremely inefficient to produce. Excreting it consumes over a dozen times as much ambient mana as the same amount of nectar. Our hive wouldn't be able to sustain itself if every ordinary member generated the jelly. That's why it's exclusive to the royal wasps. It's a scarce resource that we strategically invest in our own development, and to accelerate the growth of certain other members of the hive when necessary. Okay, that made more sense. So there just wasn't enough royal jelly to go around. If the divine order really wanted a yellowborn to reach the clear grade, maybe they could forcefully extract enough for a single person, but that would come at the detriment of the hive's development. All things considered, no individual was worth compromising Remir's only source of nectar, no matter how talented they were. Somebody should try telling Machaon that, Percy thought, his frown deepening. Evidently, the leader of House Asclepius didn't give a shit. He'd abused the power and trust that everyone had given him, selfishly putting the whole world at stake just to reach his own goals. In a disturbing way, Machaon's ambition reminded Percy of his own. Didn't he also dream of attaining divinity? And wasn't he willing to go to great lengths to achieve that? No, I'm nothing like him, Percy reassured himself. There were certain lines that he simply refused to cross. This was why he hadn't dared to steal his family's tree to awaken his second core all those years ago. Instead, he'd opted to search for an alternative source of life mana to repair the Morais decree. And, while he'd also been planning to steal an egg from the hive, Percy hadn't even known about the royal lineage or the jelly. It probably wasn't an accident that Remir's upper echelons kept that sensitive information under wraps. But Percy wouldn't have considered pulling the rug from under everyone's feet even if it had been common knowledge. And this was despite him being a redborn, not a yellowborn, thus needing every single advantage that he could get to reach the end of the color realm. He'd only ever wanted to grab a regular egg, one out of millions. His goal hadn't been to accelerate his advancement, but merely to establish his personal source of nectar, so that he wouldn't have to constantly search for more. Clearly, some people didn't have the same moral scruples as him. Now what? Can't we get your daughter back? Bastard or not, he has to have kept her alive, right? He'll need her to produce royal jelly for thousands of years before he becomes a demigod, Percy reasoned. Honestly, I don't know, the Queen replied. Naturally, it's in his best interest not to hurt her, but that doesn't mean he's been able to keep her healthy. Royal wasps are born at orange, not red, and require a lot more mana than regular wasps to survive. And that's without somebody stealing their jelly. Even if she hasn't died yet, I wouldn't be surprised if her growth has been severely stinted. I doubt she'll be able to survive long enough to reach the higher grades outside the hive's special environment. Even I struggle to sustain myself at Violet. This is the main reason none of us ever attempts to reach White, despite having a long enough lifespan for it. There's still a chance, though, Percy protested. Raise a fuss. Try to get the gods' attention. If they realize what he did, they'll get your daughter back in a day. The Queen mentally sighed again. Perhaps. Your gods are notoriously difficult to reach, however, and our kind cannot communicate with your people as easily. Whenever I tried to reach out to the guild's elders, your hunters just slaughtered my children as usual. If the situation persists, I am inevitably going to take more drastic measures, but I was hoping to find another solution. Especially since I don't know if my heir will be healthy enough to lead the hive even if we do retrieve her. What solution did you have in mind? Well, my first idea was to forcefully lay more royal eggs and hope that one would be lucky enough to survive. So far, it hasn't worked. I've only managed to drain my strength and cut my lifespan short. Percy swallowed hard upon listening to the desperation in the creature's voice. If the wasp in Machaon's possession was indeed dead or irreversibly damaged, and if the current queen also died, humanity would be screwed. Their existing gods wouldn't be affected, and a few of the Order's demigods might attain divinity too, but that would be it. With every god that died, Remir would forever have one less, until they were back in the same primitive state as Souls people, struggling to protect themselves from demi-humans and beasts. And that might actually be the best-case scenario. Percy had no idea how Remir's relationship with other worlds looked, but if they had any enemies that knew of the planet's location, they would surely pounce the moment they sensed weakness, enslaving them like Mickey's people. Any better ideas? He asked, his heart now racing with worry. I could make a push to White. For a long time, I've been balancing my consumption to sustain my core without cleansing it as much, but I bet I can get there if I really try. No starry queen in history has ever dared to evolve into an empress, yet I think that the promotion might replenish my strength and reset my ability to give birth to a new successor. Of course, I'll definitely starve to death not long after my advancement. It's either that or starving out the rest of the hive, which is unacceptable. But there's no guarantee this will work, so I've been saving it as a last resort. That sounded even scarier than just laying eggs by the dozens and hoping for one to hatch. If the queen attempted this, there would be no going back. But the violet beast wasn't done. I was torn between launching an all-out attack against your people to catch your god's attention, or ignoring your kind entirely and gambling with my evolution. And there was also the option of doing both. Reaching white would improve my ability to make noise, and eating hordes of humans would buy me some time before I ran out of food. Percy's eyes widened with horror as he realized how dangerous an all-out invasion would have been. An endless army of powerful wasps led by a white-cored starry empress. No matter the outcome, this would have been catastrophic for Remir. By the time the gods stepped in to stabilize the situation, the damage might have been irreversible. Even if they managed to restore the hive to a functional state, how many people would have lost their lives in the conflict? "What stopped you?" he asked. "You did," the queen replied. "Watching you, I realized that there might be another way out of this mess." Percy didn't need the queen to complete her explanation to know what she had in mind. Her meaning was already clear. As luck would have it, the two had actually wanted the same thing all along. If only she'd told him the last time he was here, instead of trying to have her children kidnap him, they could have avoided so much trouble. "You seem to have figured it out already," she said, before pointing at Mickey with her other foreleg. "Indeed, I want you to do the same thing you did for that creature, to help me produce a new heir." Percy didn't bother correcting her. Obviously, the wasp only wanted him to turn one of the inert eggs into a regular familiar. She likely had no idea that Mickey had already fused with him and turned into an aspect. Still, there were a couple of things he didn't understand. "How did you even learn about him? I'm sure you've observed us through your subject's eyes, but you never witnessed Mickey's creation." "Correct. In fact, I didn't see you possess the wasps either. There are too many wasps in the hive for me to control at once, and the weaker ones have rather undeveloped minds too, which makes sharing their senses difficult, if not downright unpleasant. Most of the time, I just send them vague commands en masse. Things like, harvest mana outside, or attack the intruder. Then how?" The giant bug sent Percy the mental equivalent of a shrug. "I did notice that something strange had been interfering with my control over the starry soldier for months, though I couldn't have imagined that it was somebody deliberately getting in my way. I'd simply assumed that it had been a defective wasp. I only realized that it was you after I took control of that starry night. Sadly, the soldier had already been destroyed at that point. Otherwise, I could have taken advantage of our mutual connection to reach out to you. So, you did the next best thing and tried to capture us alive," Percy replied. "Yes. Looking back into the signals I'd received from the soldier, I was able to infer how you'd injured and possessed it. And I could tell how the bird differed from the others at a glance. The wasps had merely been your minions, temporary shells you had to constantly coerce to do your bidding. But not the bird. It's a permanent creation with its own personality and better growth potential. I admit that I have no idea what happened to it in this most recent battle, but it has confirmed my guess that you can even bring creatures back from the verge of death." Okay. The queen had clearly noticed that a few things had been off with Mickey's behavior since she brought them here. Perhaps they should be more cautious while negotiating with the violet beast. She was far sharper and wiser than they'd given her credit for. Either way, their condition didn't really affect the situation much. Whatever the case, I hope you can do something similar, to breathe life into one of the inert eggs. If I'm not mistaken, turning one of my offspring into a permanent subordinate has been your goal too, right? It's why you infiltrated my hive the last time, and also why you returned to this place now. "It is," Percy admitted, still finding the queen's willingness to cooperate difficult to believe. "Aren't you worried about placing your hive's future in the hands of a complete stranger, though?" My hive's future is already bleak. I would be a fool to worry about my unborn daughter's allegiance when I cannot even grant her a life without your help. Besides, I very much hope that our arrangement will be temporary. You'll foster my successor for a single generation, until she can pass the hive to a child of her own. After that, you and your kind will leave us be and never disturb our home again. Percy sighed. Under these circumstances, he had no reason to decline the Queen's generous offer. If anything, this was quite the opportunity for him too, in more ways than one. Not only was the violet beast willing to give him exactly what he needed, but the princess would make for an even better familiar than he could have hoped for. With a single move, he'd be helping Nephthys and the Amenthei, saving Remir from certain destruction, as well as gaining leverage to prevent the other houses and possibly even the gods from bullying his loved ones. Finally, he'd obtain his personal source of not just nectar, but royal jelly, assuming that he could find a way to take advantage of it without compromising the hive's survival. I'm more than willing to try, but I can't promise results. I've only ever made a single familiar before, and it was completely by accident. At the very least, your eggs need to have some life in them for this to work, he said before scratching his head. Also, I have to fuse a different soul into your daughter's body. I already have someone in mind, but I need you to understand that your hive's future will ultimately belong to her. I've already explained how important the starry wasps are to her, but she only ever agreed to be placed in the body of a regular wasp. If she was willing to be reborn as a lowly drone, finding herself inside the body of a princess sounds to me like a bargain. The Queen insisted, some irritation flaring through their connection. I can't deny that, and you can rest assured that I'll let her know how much is depending on her. Still, I can't guarantee that she'll be willing to give you a granddaughter, and I'm not going to force her, Percy replied, standing his ground. He knew it wasn't ideal, but he couldn't help it. He'd have to hear the goddess's opinion before committing to anything else. I understand. The Queen spat a few seconds later, not sounding very pleased. If you come across this story on Amazon, it's taken without permission from the author. Report it. Percy continued, however. Even if we fail, it doesn't mean that there's nothing we can do. I would ask you to give me a regular egg to put my friend in. In exchange, I swear I'll do everything in my power to reach out to the divine order in your stead, to get your other daughter back. I don't know what state she's in, but anything is better than nothing. The Queen remained silent, but Percy could tell that she was in agreement. Pulling her leg back, she severed their connection, slowly turning around. Each thunderous stomp of her colossal limbs sent a tremor through the cavern as she entered one of the wider tunnels, motioning for him to follow with her antennae. As they walked through the long corridor, Percy had Mickey examine the pyramid again. Unlike the previous time they'd checked, there was now a giant crack that had nearly split the structure in half, revealing Nephthys' wisp. The radiant soul that had once struggled to fit within the shrunken pyramid now only occupied a fraction of its volume. Several thin tendrils stretching to every corner to keep the object from falling apart, and to shield her subjects from harm. Their own souls were barely perceptible, mere dots glinting faintly within the goddess's wisp. And if that hadn't been enough, Nephthys' soul appeared to be evaporating even faster without the pyramid's protection. Please hang in there just a little longer. We're almost there, Percy whispered, fully aware that the goddess probably couldn't hear him. The Queen brought them to another chamber, this one even wider than the last. There were fewer exits, though still dozens of them, and fewer wasps too. But there was something else here. 2 colossal pits had been dug into the floor, each filled to the brim with green goo, and Percy noticed piles upon piles of spherical objects faintly visible beneath the surface. Each was about the size of an apple, though their glossy shells were pitch black, with countless colorful dots adorning them, much like the wasp's carapaces. The eggs in one pit appeared slightly different, however. Golden watermarks rippled around their surfaces, giving them a pattern resembling the one on the Queen's own exoskeleton. Stopping at the center of the room, the violet beast waited for Percy to re-establish their mental link, something that he didn't hesitate to do. Only then did she explain what they were seeing. Our kind can be separated into 3 main types. The first are the royal wasps like me and my kidnapped daughter. Only one can be born per generation, but you can clearly see all my failed attempts at producing a second, she said, pointing at the piles of eggs with the golden markings. Wasps with a royal lineage are only considered mature after reaching the violet grade, at which point they are known as starry queens. Like I mentioned earlier, they are born at orange instead of red, and are called starry princesses up to and including the blue grade. Percy nodded. I guess the second type includes all the other wasps I've seen until now? Indeed. Those make up the overwhelming majority of our ranks. From red to blue, they are the starry drones, workers, soldiers, knights, and commanders. But what you might not know is that non-royal wasps are incapable of evolving past blue. Percy frowned upon hearing that. This was something that he hadn't heard before. Until today, he hadn't even known that the queen came from a different caste of bugs than the rest. The reason for their inability to grow past a certain point wasn't difficult to guess. It was probably the same one that restricted the queen from producing multiple princesses. Less competition for her heir. If every wasp had the potential to reach Violet, some might fall outside her control, challenging her rule. Whatever the reason, it was his lucky break that the queen had offered him a superior egg to fashion his familiar out of. Otherwise, he might have ended up stuffing Nephthys' soul into a defective body stuck at the lower grades. I take it the drones hatch from this other pile of eggs, then? He asked. Not quite, the queen said, shaking her head. She remained motionless for a few seconds, probably relaying a command to her subjects. A few of the smaller wasps in the room crawled into the second pit, placing a few of the eggs without the golden markings onto their backs before carrying them out of the chamber and through some of the other tunnels. Only once they were alone did the queen resume her explanation. There are tens of millions of wasps in the hive, and only a single queen. Naturally, it would be impossible for me to lay all the eggs by myself. That's where the third type of wasps come in. They act as the intermediary between me and the rest. The violet beast remained perfectly still, clearly waiting for something. The cavern shook again, another massive creature slowly approaching. Percy watched curiously as a second behemoth crawled out of a corridor about a minute later, a blue star thrumming rhythmically inside its thorax. At first, he thought this was a starry commander, the first of its kind that he'd ever laid eyes upon. But he soon realized that this wasn't quite right. This wasp had a very different body structure from the others he had seen, including the queen. Clearly wasn't designed for combat or even moving around much. First, the creature had no wings or eyes. Its frame was far bulkier than the rest. Its thorax and abdomen almost fused into a single, bulbous cylinder that its 6 stubby limbs struggled to support. On closer examination, the wasp appeared too large for a blue beast. It was still smaller than the queen, but not by much. At the very least, it was far bigger than the creatures Percy had seen on Thescala. Finally, it didn't have a stinger either, but rather countless small holes spiraling all the way from where the stinger should have been, to about 2/3 of the way around its abdomen. As if to demonstrate their purpose, the creature's body convulsed a couple of times, squelching sounds emanating from the holes as they vomited countless small eggs. They were coated in a similar type of green goo to the ones in the pits, but these were smaller than the others, barely the width of 2 fingers. The creature didn't stop until 2 tall mounds had formed by its sides. These will hatch into drones, the queen explained. As for the ones in the pit, they will hatch into the orange versions of the starry breeders. Much like my wingless daughter there. Percy nodded in understanding. Each queen could only directly give birth to a single princess and countless immature breeders, while the breeders themselves would be the ones tasked with populating the rest of the hive after reaching blue. In essence, all the wasps Percy and Mickey had seen in the past, as well as all the bugs that the guild's hunters harvested nectar from on a daily basis, weren't actually the queen's children, but her grandchildren. However, the violet beast hadn't brought them here just to give them a tour of the hive. Turning her head toward the pile with the marked eggs, she spoke again. Well, what do you think? Is any of them salvageable? Mickey walked up to the queen, placing his hand on one of her legs to establish a new mental link with her, freeing Percy up to examine the eggs. Reaching the edge of the pit, he leaned slightly over the viscous fluid to scan the objects. He took an awfully long amount of time too, checking the entire pile carefully from tip to base, making full use of his mutated eyes as he searched for any traces of life that he could capitalize upon. By the time he announced his verdict, his heart had sunk. Every single one of them is dead.